Turn this on. All right, we will call to order this meeting of the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency Board of Directors. And Charlotte, will you lead us in the pledge?
Certainly. Please rise, place your hand over your heart, and join me in the pledge to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call, please.
Chair West.
Here.
Director Aranio.
Here.
Director Craven.
Here.
Director Borchert.
Here.
Agenda review, anything to move around?
Nothing, Chair.
Thank you. All right, public comments. This is an opportunity for public comments for matters not otherwise on the agenda. Please step forward, state your name.
Thank you, Chair West, and as Director Steve Nash from Oxnard. And I want to thank Deputy Director Anselm for his letter to the Star, addressing some of the very pertinent issues that water entails. And I think, even though this is not politically possible right now, I think it's an appropriate time to start talking about how we can wean M&I away from groundwater. If we have any desire to protect agriculture in certainly on the Oxnard Plain, we should make it a point to ensure that they have a water supply, and that is groundwater. I think, based on the historical development of groundwater, was primarily for agriculture. The cities can afford to develop and utilize alternative sources of water. So, as a supporter of SOAR, I am more than happy to engage in this discussion about how we protect agriculture, and the only way we can do that is to make sure that they have a reliable and a dependable source of water, and that's from our groundwater basin. So, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any other public comments on matters not otherwise on the agenda? Board comments? Robert?
None.
Charlotte? Dave? No? Thank you. Okay, moving on to the consent agenda.
Move the approval.
Second?
I'll second. Oops.
Sorry.
I had a couple of comments on the, and I thought I made notes. Okay. It's on the minutes of the August 11 meeting. Page 2 of 3, item number 1, second to last paragraph. It reads, Director Bennett stated that he is generally not comfortable with an operating budget that is not in balance. And I believe that discussion is accurately portrayed. But what I think is missing from this paragraph was also the discussion that we did talk about the fact that even though the operating budget, the operating portion of that budget may not look to have been balanced, we had quite a large fund balance reserve that actually looked to be increasing over the years. And therefore, it was probably not such a bad thing. The second comment I would make would be page 3 of 3, item number 2. States Director Borchard, this is near the end of that section, third paragraph from the end. Director Borchard commented that there shouldn't be general statements made about the groundwater levels because depending on the time viewed. I didn't really say depending on the time viewed, more, or if I did, that wasn't my intention. More what I'm trying to say here is that not all hydrographs that we saw that day represented a generally declining groundwater levels, and in fact some seem to be stable. That's all.
Any objections to those amendments to the minutes?
No.
There's a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda. All in favor?
Aye.
Moving on to item number 4, groundwater sustainability plan update. Item 3 was part of the consent agenda.
Good afternoon, Chair West, board members. For the record, I'm Kim Love, GMA staff. And so this is your monthly update on the progress towards developing the GSPs for the basins within Fox Canyon. And the way that I plan to present this item is I'll have some just a quick update of some of the work that's been done and the meetings that have been held and the work that TAG's done. Then I'll ask Dudek to come up and give a presentation and update on the work that they have been doing. And then I'll follow that by talking about some of the remaining tasks that need to be done for the TAG, schedule for tentative for your board in order to consider the various pieces of the GSPs that need to be considered by your board and weigh in on that for moving forward with the schedule for bringing the draft GSPs to you, and then some discussion in general about the schedule as well following that. So that's my plan. If we could get the item 4A slides up.
Excuse me, Kim, did we move over item 3 or postpone it?
It's on the consent agenda.
Oh, consent, got it. Sorry.
No problems. So this is just going to show what some of the work that has been done. The TAG held a special, well, first I'd like to say there's a lot of progress has been made on the GSPs. I feel like there's a real sense of momentum in terms of getting these things developed. A lot of work's been done. The TAG held a special meeting in July 27th. And this goes back to July. As you recall, August was just a special meeting on a couple topics. You didn't have a general update. And on sustainable management criteria, we're up. TAG held regular meetings on August 3rd and September 7th to discuss the various items, including the water budgets, water levels, water quality maps, all those things that we've been working on. The TAG also broke up into several ad hoc subcommittees to look at this sustainable management issues, and especially in terms of how are we going to measure and monitor those sustainability indicators in the Las Posas, Oxnard, and Pleasant Valley basins. And so he held ad hoc meetings following the 2 regular meetings on the 3rd and the 7th, a joint ad hoc meeting with Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins simultaneous with another room discussions on the Las Posas basin. Those were posted and advertised. We did have some public folks that were present for those, and so a lot of work got done there as well. There's 2 GSP workshops, as you well know. The first one was last Wednesday evening for the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins. It was a very well-received workshop by Dudek, and Directors Aranio, Bennett, and West were able to attend that one. The second one for the Las Posas Basin is tonight right here in this next room, and the next regular TAG meeting is the 6th. So at this point, unless there's any questions on those items, I'll turn it over to Jill Weinberger with Dudek to give you an update on their work progress.
While she's approaching the podium, let me just comment for a moment on the the September 20th workshop and thank the folks from DUDEC. It was by far the most substantive and informative presentation that I've seen on the subject. I'm looking forward to this evening's, and I want to thank you very much for all the work that went into that.
Thank you very much, Director West. For those of you who have not met me yet, my name is Jill Weinberger. I'm with DUDEC. And much of what we talked about on last Wednesday's workshop is actually going to be what I'm going to be presenting right now. I think, did I manage to get myself out of the slide presentation? I can do this without slides. It might not be quite as informative.
While you're hunting for those, let me just make mention, I neglected to mention earlier that alternates Mike Mobley and Andy Waters are here as well. Can't quite see the back. I don't see any of their alternates back there. But
Is it staff that has to get this back up or up in the booth? Do they have to get this PowerPoint back up?
It's booth.
Okay, great.
They're working on it. Perfect. There we go. This should look familiar to many of you. So I am here to present the technical work that we've done so far towards developing water budgets, sustainable yield, and undesirable results. This is specific to the Pleasant Valley and Oxnard basins. We will be doing a very similar presentation, although clearly targeted towards the Las Posas Valley Basin tonight. To jump right in, we have to actually review all of the components of the water balance. And this is the simplest way of looking at a water balance equation. This is what you would have in a native basin that doesn't have production, has some interaction with other basins, but this is the simplest equation that you can throw up here. And I will admit that, you know, the worst thing you can do is start out your presentation with a slide full of words and then throw an equation on top of it. But it's just addition and subtraction. So all we're doing here is we're trying to look at how much water is coming into the basin and how much water is going out of the basin. And in this case, we're talking about Oxnard and Pleasant Valley simultaneously because they are connected. And we'll push that theme throughout this talk. That we can look at this. I hope I have the pointer here. Here we go. So we're going to define it all in terms of change in storage. And that change in storage term you can think of as your bank account. How much water is sitting in your basin right now? How much money is sitting in your bank account right now? You have inflow. In a native simple system, your inflow is precipitation and potentially some inflow in the subsurface. So that's that P is precipitation and Q in is that inflow in the subsurface. Taking away from that, you have your outflows. You have your runoff and your base flow in streams. You have evapotranspiration, and you also have the outflow in the subsurface. Can I undo this pointer, or am I sort of always reaching for this?
I think it's just was charging.
Okay. We'll see if this still works. That's better. As I said before, one of the themes we're going to talk about is the interconnectedness of these basins, and another theme we're going to talk about is uncertainty. And there is, in fact, uncertainty in all of these terms in this water balance equation. It's not as simple as your bank account and tracking how much money is coming in and going out. In this particular native system, the only thing you're actually measuring is precipitation, and that's what you're measuring falling at the surface. That's not a measurement of what makes it to the groundwater. In your case, we're going to add in pumping as well, and you're measuring pumping. But the rest of these terms, we are estimating, or we are using a numerical groundwater model to simulate. This is our very messy first attempt to look at exactly what all of these terms are. And so I don't actually need you to focus on all of the little details of this diagram. The red arrows and the red symbols on this diagram are water that's flowing out of, in this case, the Oxnard Basin. And the blue symbols and the blue arrows are water that's flowing into that basin. So if you're going to perform a water balance, you need to track all of the stuff all of the water that's coming in and all of the water that is coming out. We've highlighted here the Oxnard and Magoo aquifers in the upper aquifer system, and then the Hueneme and Fox Canyon in the lower aquifer system. The other thing that we're going to point out here, again, to harp on the theme of interconnectedness, is we have flow across the basin boundaries, in this case, into the Las Posas and Pleasant Valley basins, and you can have flow across the basin boundary into the Pacific Ocean, to and from the Pacific Ocean. This is the Pleasant Valley version of that same diagram. Again, red arrows are water leaving the basin, blue arrows and symbols are water coming into the basin. In this case, we have a slightly different nomenclature. We lose the names for the upper aquifer system aquifers, and in Pleasant Valley it's referred to as the older alluvium. But we still have, and we also lose the name of the Hueneme aquifer, but it's the age equivalent to the upper San Pedro. And then we have the Fox and Grimes Canyon aquifers. Pleasant Valley is even a little bit more broken up in the subsurface. Geologically, we have more faulting in Pleasant Valley, and as we progress and we begin to better monitor areas throughout the basin, we may end up wanting to move to management areas within this basin. And you can see the faulting here on the diagram, again, if I can find the cursor, in these dashed lines in the subsurface. The focus, again, subsurface flow between Pleasant Valley and Oxnard. These basins are interconnected, and that's important because management decisions made by this board will affect the water balance in each basin. There's also a key term here, which is the leakage from Arroyo Las Posas, crossing in. There's surface leakage from the arroyo, which has not been active in recent years. That's wastewater treatment inflow that has been flowing down the arroyo, and that has not crossed into Pleasant Valley Basin in several years now. But there's also subsurface inflow from the Las Posas Valley Basin. So if we start with the one thing that we know well, the one thing we've been measuring for a long time, we can look at precipitation. And this is particularly important in these basins where you're going to see water level changes that happen on drought and interdrought cycles. And we can define these droughts by looking at this cumulative departure from the mean precipitation curve in blue. Now, the way we get that curve is we actually measure precipitation here in purple. So that's our measured annual precipitation, and the average of that measured annual precipitation is the dashed line that runs along the bottom here. In years where we have above average precipitation, our blue line, our departure line, goes up. That's a year where we get more rainfall than we would have on an average year. And on years where it's below that line, our blue line goes down. And we can see we have periods of prolonged downward trends in this blue line. Sorry, Jeff, I see you looking over there. The cursor's working on both. Okay. So we have periods of prolonged downward trends in the blue line. That's a period of drought. So we have a series of below average years. There may be one or two above average years in there, but overall, we've had a prolonged period of below average precipitation. And then in the intervening periods, we have periods of above average precipitation. This gray bar back between 1918 and 1936, that's an 18-year drought in the record. And this period right here of above average precipitation runs from about 1993 to 2011. Overall, above average. There were certainly some below average years mixed in there. And that is, of course, when we have most of our data. So our data is going to be biased by this period of above average precipitation we see later in the record. We can tie that cumulative departure curve, which is now in black on this slide, to water levels. And I think many of you have seen slides similar to this at other presentations. The obvious big swings in the blue lines and the orange, these are all the water levels. The black is the cumulative departure. And the big swings in the water levels are the pumping cycles. overall, though, the trends in the upper aquifer system follow that of the cumulative departure from the mean fairly well. Now, that's influenced by both.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
you said the big swings are from the...
Pumping. So pumping cycles. So during the year when you're actually pumping your well, the water level in the well
Thank you.
drops, and then it'll recover. Overall, it tracks the cumulative departure curve pretty well. Again, not the big swings, but the overall trends track the cumulative departure curve pretty well, and that's both from recharge from precipitation and then concurrently in Oxnard, when you have higher precipitation years, you're also able to spread more in the spreading basins, and so you see recharge during the wetter than average years, and you see recovery in the water levels. Oh, I apologize. I should go back. The other thing I want to point out here is that the water level elevations in the upper aquifer system tend to hover around sea level. 0 here is feet mean sea level, so that is sea level. We have periods of above sea level and below. If we switch to looking at the lower aquifer system, we actually see, again, trends overall match the cumulative departure fairly well, and this is also influenced by precipitation and spreading in the spreading basins. We see, again, the swings in the water levels that are related to pumping in that well, but over here we see that water levels in the lower aquifer system are generally below sea level, and that is going to induce a landward gradient that will result in seawater intrusion. And if we look then at what the inflows to the Oxnard Basin are, here we have the spreading grounds that's taking up the majority of the inflow, 48,000 acre-feet on average annually between 1985 and 2015. But a large component of this recharge to the Oxnard Basin is also seawater intrusion, about 11,600 acre-feet on average annually. We also have subsurface inflow from Pleasant Valley. Here is another one that we're going to be focusing on because of the interconnectedness between the Pleasant Valley and Oxnard basins. Now, these values in this pie chart are from the United Water Conservation District modeling efforts. And while they are our best available numbers right now, they are going to be changing as United continues to modify its model and improve its model. And they also have not been subject to a sensitivity analysis to determine the level of uncertainty in each of these values. So there is uncertainty associated with each of these, and we can, moving forward, begin to quantify that uncertainty, but that has not been done to this point.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
While you're on this chart, so I appreciate that there's uncertainty with this, but the best information we have at this point in time, it'd be accurate to say that on average in the 30-year period that was referenced here, the spreading grounds added 48,000 acre-feet a year, and seawater intrusion added 11,000 acre-feet a year.
That is what is on this slide with our best available understanding at this point in time, yeah.
Thank you. And we don't anticipate that the spreading grounds will be that productive in the future.
That's correct. That's another level of uncertainty that is even beyond this modeling effort of quantifying the uncertainty in these particular historical values, that moving forward into the future, we have other regulatory issues to examine that will certainly have the potential to reduce the spreading in the spreading grounds.
Thank you.
We can look at the same chart for Pleasant Valley. And in this Pleasant Valley chart, again, these are, I'm going to give you the same warnings up front about this that I did at the end of the previous slide. These are from the United modeling efforts and have not, the uncertainty about these numbers has not been quantified yet. So here we have subsurface inflow from the Las Posas Valley Basin. And we've highlighted, in fact, a large uncertainty there, although we can't, as a technical person, you want to be able to put a number on it, and I can't do that for you today. But it is large, and we suspect that this number will also go down in the future. There's a lot of discussion about this number right now in the TAG. And we've also see here inflow, we see direct percolation of rainfall. Again, this is getting at what actually makes it to the water level as opposed to what is falling at the surface. And then returns from agricultural irrigation, urban, and leakage from arroyo Las Posas. Those are the inflows. We also have to account for the outflows. So what are those? Well, we've got outflow at the basin boundaries. We've already mentioned in the previous inflow slide that the outflow from the Las Posas Valley Basin is treated as inflow to the Pleasant Valley Basin, and outflow from Pleasant Valley is inflow to Oxnard. So they all tie together. We have to look at outflow from the basin boundaries. We have to look at transpiration requirements of plants, discharge to tile drains in the Oxnard subbasin, discharge and base flow in streams, and then production. And here again, the one thing we know in this is production, pumping. So if we look at how pumping is related to change in storage, so taking the first approach here of pumping in the blue bars and change in storage, this is annual change in storage, so this would be effectively how much money you make or lose on any given year. You can actually see that there's not a strong correlation between pumping and change in storage in the Oxnard subbasin. These again are taken from the United model. And you would expect in that native simple system that I talked about in that very first slide, that the more you pump, the less water you would have in storage, the less water would be returned, the less overall annual water you would have in storage on any given year. But you don't really see that negative relationship in this in this graph. What you do see is a strong relationship between the green bars, which is spreading, and the black line, which is storage. And so what we see here is when United is able to spread water in the subbasin, we have higher storage, and when they're not, we have lower storage. Again, uncertainty in these numbers. If we instead look at cumulative change in storage, so year over year, what are we facing as far as our bank account, not just at the end of this year, but at the end of 30 years, we see there is a long-term decline in storage in the Oxnard subbasin. And this is if we don't have seawater intrusion. The other thing we need to factor in, though, is we know we do have, I take that back. We do have seawater intrusion, so the numbers actually look a little bit better when we currently, if you just look at the United model, and I'm trying to pull up the cursor. So if you just look at the output of the United model, the red line would actually be up higher. And the reason for that is that there is seawater intrusion that has come into the basin, and it's actually physically replaced freshwater storage in the basin. So if you actually remove that seawater, this is the cumulative change in storage that we observe over 30 years in the United model. We have to tie, under Sigma, we have to tie the water budget analysis, which is just simple inflows and outflows, although perhaps not so simple, to undesirable results if we're going to actually start to talk about sustainable yield. And one of the undesirable results is, in fact, a change in groundwater storage. So we've seen that in Oxnard we have a long-term decline in groundwater storage, and some of the storage has, in fact, been replaced by saltwater. The other undesirable results that we have to look at under Sigma are degraded water quality, subsidence, surface water, groundwater interaction. So pumping near surface water bodies can draw down the groundwater table and actually draw down the surface water as a result. So we can't deplete surface water bodies. that is an undesirable result. Chronic lowering of groundwater levels and seawater intrusion, and we've certainly mentioned seawater intrusion today. Moving forward right now, we're going to focus on what are some of the water quality issues. I'm not going to talk about subsidence. DWR has published some guidance on subsidence, and neither the Oxnard nor Pleasant Valley basins are at high risk under their guidance for additional subsidence. And I will also talk about some of the concerns with surface water depletion. As far as degraded water quality, we've got, this is an example of plots that we're developing and have been developed for the Oxnard and the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins on water quality. These are water quality constituents that we're interested in are nitrate, TDS, chloride, sulfate, and boron. This plot is actually the nitrate concentrations measured 2011 to 2015, and it's the maximum at a well between 2011 and 2015. And the relationship shown here is that in the upper aquifer system, which is what's shown in this plot, we see that there is, in fact, degraded water quality, higher nitrate concentrations near the forebay. And that's, again, related to spreading. So in years where United is able to spread more water, nitrate concentrations decrease. These are shown as the maximum over that multi-year period. So they're showing you sort of the worst-case scenario with higher concentrations and lower groundwater elevations in that area. We're doing this consistent with the basin monitoring objectives put together by the agency for previous reports. Another undesirable result is this depletion of surface and groundwater. This is a map that was produced by the Nature Conservancy looking at potential groundwater-dependent ecosystems in the Oxnard subbasin. Those are shown in green. And these ecosystems are, in fact, reliant upon the semi-perch zone water. And so they're not actually relying on the Oxnard aquifer. These are shallow water-dependent ecosystems. And the Nature Conservancy has mapped 6 of them for this particular subbasin. And the reason that this is important to keep track of is that if we move forward and if the board moves forward with management decisions that begin to utilize water from the shallow zone, from the semi-perch zone, which is not currently being done, then that has the potential in specific areas to affect the groundwater-dependent ecosystems. In order to address some of these concerns, United, specifically for seawater intrusion, United did some initial forecasting to look at what groundwater elevations may be necessary. And if you think back to those groundwater elevation plots I showed earlier, we had groundwater elevations that were near sea level in the upper aquifer system, and they were below sea level in the lower aquifer system. At the coast, in order to achieve a hydrostatic balance, United is forecasting that in the Grimes Canyon aquifer, you would need to have groundwater elevations that are positive 28.5 feet. In the Fox, it'd be 23.5 feet above sea level. In Hueneme, 11, Mugu, 8, and Oxnard, 6 feet. Now, these are groundwater elevations at the coast. These don't have to apply across the entire basin, but these have to be sufficient at the coast to reduce the inflow of water in the head from the ocean from pushing into the Oxnard subbasin and intruding the aquifer. So when we combine our understanding of what the potential undesirable results are with our understanding of the water balance, we actually start to understand what the sustainable yield of the basins will be. And the sustainable yield as defined under sigma is, in fact, the maximum quantity of groundwater that can be produced without having undesirable results. One of the things we talked about in the public meeting, and I'm sure staff and will be able to elaborate on more than I can, is that these are actually significant and there's another word, unreasonable, undesirable results, and that is left to the agencies to determine in conjunction with stakeholders, at a level that the state will accept. So the state does not say there can't be any undesirable results. They just can't be significant and unreasonable. The sustainable yield, I do want to emphasize, though, is it's distinct from overdraft conditions. It can occur without a basin being in overdraft, and you can imagine a scenario where you concentrate all of your pumping at the coast in the Oxnard subbasin. You don't have to produce all of the water from the subbasin that you can at the coast without getting seawater intrusion. If you have a whole bunch of wells at the coast and you're pumping there, but you're only pumping a small fraction of the inflow to the basin, you're still going to produce seawater intrusion at the coast. And in this case, we also have to factor in that groundwater pumping in the lower aquifer system in Pleasant Valley has in fact contributed to seawater intrusion in the Oxnard subbasin. So we have to manage these basins coherently.
And I appreciate your comment about at the coast, if you pump, even if you're not pumping a lot, you could. What about the reverse? And that is, if you're pumping a lot inland, can you induce saltwater intrusion, even though you're not pumping at the coast?
So I feel as though this is one of those questions that I may step in some political landmines, and I'm going to try to avoid. The answer is theoretically yes, of course. But there are geologic and hydrologic constraints that you would have to look at to determine for a specific basin whether or not production inland would induce seawater intrusion at the coast.
Thank you.
Okay. So this is just an example. So to highlight that point, that in fact, in this case, groundwater production all the way into Pleasant Valley has impacted seawater intrusion. This is showing the pumping in acre feet. The larger symbols here are higher pumping rates per year. This is in 2015. So the reds and the orange is between 100 and 1,000 acre feet, and the red is over 1,000 acre feet of production from each of these wells in a given year in 2015. And production in the lower aquifer system is concentrated in such a way as to induce seawater intrusion at Point Magoo. And we see that when we look at groundwater elevations in the Fox Canyon aquifer for that same year, 2015. This is the fall, and we see that that groundwater elevations in the Fox Canyon are 140 feet below sea level in this inland area here, and that below sea level groundwater elevations extend well into Pleasant Valley. And up in the northern part of Pleasant Valley, you do have groundwater elevations that are above sea level again, and those are in part, they have been influenced by the inflow of wastewater treatment plant water in the past. So what does this mean as far as sustainability? When we look at the groundwater modeling efforts that have been done to date, with all of the cautions on the uncertainty and needing to quantify the uncertainty moving forward, that we have overall a decline in storage of 6,500 acre feet per year between 1985 and 2015 in the Oxnard subbasin. That's an underestimate due to seawater intrusion. So if you take the seawater intrusion out of that, then you average 11,600 acre feet per year of decline in storage in the Oxnard subbasin. So when we look at it together, I'm sorry, I said I misspoke there. This 11,600 acre feet is, in fact, the seawater intrusion estimate. So you have to factor both of those in. You have to add them together. So you have 6,500 acre-feet per year of declining in storage. You have 11,600 acre-feet per year of seawater intrusion. Together, those sum to your total decline in storage, and that's 19,100 acre-feet per year for this basin. If you just look at the drought period, which is 2012 to 2015, we have an average of 47,000 acre-feet per year decline in storage, with an additional 16,000 acre-feet per year of seawater intrusion, for a total here of 63,000 acre-feet per year. That's during the drought period. For Pleasant Valley, do the same thing. And in fact, in Pleasant Valley, the model estimates indicate that groundwater storage increased on average 4,000 acre-feet per year over the length of the model. But we can't lose track of that high value of inflow from the Las Posas Basin, that wastewater treatment plant inflow, the subsurface inflow from Las Posas. And because it includes that 8,400 acre-feet per year of inflow from Las Posas, this estimate is likely very high. I wish we could quantify it for you. We can't yet. We're working towards that moving forward. In 2012 to 2015, over that drought period, including, again, this 8,400 acre-feet of inflow, we have 13,000 acre-feet per year of decline in the Pleasant Valley Basin. So now we have to put that change in storage together with the undesirable results to get at sustainability. And using the United model, knowing that there is some uncertainty, knowing that United is currently revising the model and working to reduce that uncertainty and working to quantify the uncertainty, what we find for sustainability is that in Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins, the pumping needs to be reduced to approximately 60,000 acre-feet per year to prevent seawater intrusion. This still assumes historical spreading rates. So that still assumes that 48,000 acre-feet a year of spreading can move forward. And it also assumes, on the converse side of that, that no projects would be initiated to potentially increase sustainability. So we can, in fact, develop projects that would produce additional water. They could either be infrastructure projects that would help move pumping in the basin around to mitigate against the undesirable results, or they can be projects that actually produce water. Here's that last cautionary note. The United model is currently and actively being modified, and it's being modified to address comments by the technical advisory group that's been very active in this process. And they are looking at quantifying the levels of uncertainty. So moving forward, these numbers will change, but by how much we can't tell you at this point. The good thing is that Sigma actually allows for uncertainty. This is a plot that you've seen before. I won't belabor the details of this plot too much, other than to say, you know, right now in 2015, we're in here. We're working towards 2020 with a plan that has a level of uncertainty shown by the black bars. There are many paths towards achieving sustainability, and Sigma does account for uncertainty and allows for factoring in uncertainty when you produce a plan to move towards sustainability. This plan is one that would minimize the short-term economic disruption, and this was a discussion we had a little bit at the meeting last Wednesday, where you can reduce pumping in such a way to fall within the bounds of uncertainty, but you don't have to instantly decrease pumping dramatically until you reach your sustainability in 2040. And during that time, the uncertainty is reduced with each 5-year update. The sustainable yield may also change with projects and other factors, reductions in spreading moving forward. And in order to get there, we will have to spell out in the plan, and the agency will have to understand what the interim milestones are. The technical advisory group is working towards those. I think Kim talked about that. What are the measurable objectives for this plan? How do you account for the progress you've made towards achieving sustainability? The measurable objectives have to provide operational flexibility. They have to account for this uncertainty. And they have to take into account the historical water budgets, but moving forward, they also have to do some projections, and they have to be commensurate with levels of uncertainty. And this is the last slide that's a little bit more complex than the simple one that I just showed, saying, all right, we've got extractions. The extractions have to be reduced with time. How do you do that to come within the bounds of uncertainty and also factor in projects? You don't have to know all your projects right now. The projects can be factored in with these 5-year updates, and those projects can, in fact, increase the sustainable yield of the basin by minimizing undesirable results, such as seawater intrusion. I think that's the end of my presentation. I'm certain there will be questions.
Questions from the board?
Thank you, and I just want to compliment you. You explained things very clearly with something that can be very complicated. At the hearing, I brought up the issue of how do we know what the undesirable impacts are going to be during this 20-year phase-in cycle? And I appreciated the answer. I'm really repeating it for the benefit of those people who aren't there, which is that's one of the things you'll study, but we really don't have a forecasting model for that at this point in time. But Director Aranio and I both were sort of asking the same question. It seems to me we ought to have an answer, which is while we stay in the period where we're taking more than what the model says at this point in time, we know there's some uncertainty with that. What if the model is correct and it is 60,000, what will the saltwater intrusion level be 20 years from now, so that so we know how much damage we're doing while we're waiting to get to that level. But I realize you don't have an answer to that. But I have a different question today that's related to that. While I appreciate that we have to be cautious as we ramp down, and I want to do that, be cautious as we ramp down. Does it make sense, and what would be the impact if we said those water levels that are 120 and 140 feet below sea level, could we identify those as a potential marker and say, while we're not going to get those all the way back up to where we're going to stop saltwater intrusion, because to do that we have to get above sea level. Now, it's going to take a long time to do that. Can we at least identify a marker that says we will not let those get worse? And what would it take for us to incorporate that into our sustainability plan to say they're not going to get worse and they have to be 10% better 5 years from now, or else we'll do something. They have to be 25% better, 10 years from now, or we're going to do something. And can you tell me what that would entail? And maybe more of a question than is doable at this point in time. But
well, I'm going to probably pass it off to Peter in a moment. He looks like he's anxious to answer something. But I will say that is absolutely part of the groundwater sustainability plan development process. And so those discussions are being held in the technical advisory group meetings right now, and recommendations to have those sustainability objectives will in fact be coming out. And so I think there are two parts to this. One is that I don't want to mislead you by saying that minus 140 foot groundwater elevation inland has to come up instantly. Those groundwater elevations I was talking about that United forecast, those were coastal groundwater elevations to reduce the seawater intrusion impacts.
I understand that.
And the model can be run multiple times to look at scenarios of what would it look like to have production that would still maintain minus 140-foot elevation in those areas while keeping seawater intrusion at bay with the appropriate groundwater elevations at the coast. So those are the kind of modeling efforts moving forward that can begin to address your question. And that has, those setting of targets has to be part of this plan.
Okay.
So those discussions are ongoing.
Great. And I appreciate, I don't pretend to say that the 140 has to come all the way up, but I do know at the coast,
Right.
ultimately, we want to get that if we want to stop saltwater intrusion. But the idea of arresting the decline in the water quality level, it seems to me that from a board policy standpoint, if we're saying we've got a problem, we ought to at least stop making it worse. We may not be able to stop the whole problem, quickly. We may need, a decade more, 2 decades to actually get to that where we stop altogether. But we should take at least enough action to make sure that it doesn't get worse. And if things are getting worse from where we're starting, then we have to look at some other different action and stuff. So, okay, thank you. Enough.
I have a question before he comes up. My question, let's see, is this working? Okay, there we go. My question has to do with the plan itself and its timing and how it's going to be presented. I understand that we have this GSA plan or GSP that will be presented to us for consideration and adoption. I guess my question is, based upon the information that I've seen so far in the workshops and what's been presented here today, will there be a variety of options in order to weigh possible scenarios and what would the trade-offs be? Let's take the seawater intrusion again as an option. In your candlestick ramp down over 20 years, we're going to assume that there will be seawater that will advance inland over that period of time. One scenario may be, and I'm just hypothetical here, people, don't jump up and down on this one. Let's say we go to a 10-year ramp back, where that would be and what the impacts would be as far as restoration and arresting of the undesirable impacts. Or am I going to be presented with one plan that this is what the stakeholders have put in, this is what our technical analysis is of that, and here, bless it?
I'm actually going to pass that to Peter. I think I don't have a good answer for you right now. I know that we are striving to analyze different results and different scenarios, and also that this plan is intended to be a living document, so that it's not intended to be hand it to you, this is your number, and we walk away. The procedural part of that I'm not as certain of.
I'm not sure I have a better answer, but I have an additional answer, which is that we're still working through that aspect of what would go on. And I think if we look at the interim milestones, I mean, we would, if we're shooting for, let's just say 28 feet in the Grimes near the coast, we would say in 5 years, it should come up 25% of the way, and in 10 years, 50% of the way. But take into account adverse conditions. And so if you're off your schedule and your target, but you've been in a 6 or 7 year drought, well, I think you may hold off on taking action at that point. If you were ahead of schedule, but you've had the 3 wettest years in the last 100 years, you might still think about taking other actions. The plan identifies projects, and there's an ad hoc committee of TAG, which is bringing forward projects which have already been developed, and will evaluate those in terms of how many acre feet of water they can, additionally bring to bear to ameliorate this. In terms of a hard bottom, there's been discussion that in terms of avoiding subsidence, we would seek not to go below historical low water levels. But again, you have to look at if we're in an 8-year drought, you may temporarily go lower. And I think that the plan should provide that kind of flexibility. And I brought some slides in terms of how far the seawater intrusion might go. I don't know that answer. And I think if we develop a density-driven groundwater model, which would more explicitly model seawater intrusion, we might start to get some answers, which would still have uncertainty. But I brought 4 graphs which show chloride concentrations through time. And in particular, there's one from, I think it's the Oxnard, which shows the concentration going up in the 90s of chloride. And then as we get out of that drought from 87 to 91, the chloride concentrations drop down. So it's not necessarily irreversible out at the front. I think, if you're up at 18,000, maybe it's a little more of an issue. But there is some reversibility to it that has already been observed at the coast.
I have a question.
All right.
I'm not sure which of the DUDEC people is better suited to answer it, but just what you said, and I've asked this question a few times now, and I seem to keep getting different answers. We know that when it doesn't rain and when there's not a lot of spreading and there's conversely a lot of pumping, that we're likely going to get a lot of seawater intrusion. And conversely, when we get a lot of spreading and a lot of rain and very little pumping, we're told that chloride levels improve. Is it in fact possible, or does it happen, that in ideal situations, when we have, and I think it's most dependent on United's actions in the spreading grounds, when we get a large amount of spreading because that water really just goes straight into the ground very quickly there, do we in fact push seawater out in times like that? Because I've heard anecdotal stories of, for example, when the Freeman first got up and running and we had big recharges going in, that we had artesian wells popping up in backyards in Port Hueneme that weren't known to exist. And that would seem to tell me that if we're not pushing seawater out, we're at least diluting it, which again is one of those major tenets of pollution, right? The answer to pollution is dilution many times.
EPA generally doesn't accept that, but yes, I think
I understand.
You're right. Well, let me, if I can remember how to do this. Here's an example from the Grimes Aquifer where we have a steady rise in chloride from about 500 to about 6,000. Bottom button forward. Big button. But here's an example from the Oxnard, which is sort of what you're saying, which is what I was alluding to. Hold down the middle button. Okay, there it is. Where chloride concentrations here, we're in the 20,000 chloride concentration. The scale is over here. In the early 90s, and then as water levels rose to be above seawater, at this well, the concentrations of chloride dropped, not back to fresh, but back to less than 5,000 when, how do I go backwards? Yeah, sorry. When water levels dropped briefly, it came back up again, and now in this drought, they've come back up. So,
where's this well?
I hope that's on this map. It's near the, is it? Sorry, now I have to go back. So this is 27.5, yes. So that is this one right here. So, inside the work that United and the USGS have done have, shown areas of seawater intrusion around in here and here. And, west or south of the one in Wainimi Road. But, this is pretty close to the coast. Those were high concentrations. And it did come back. But it requires, that the head be high and that there be enough water flowing backwards. Here's another example of the Wainimi, where you have it's just climbs from 6,000 to 12,000, and even with the water levels, there it is. Even with the water levels above sea level in 95, you still have this steady climb. So it's a very complicated picture.
Okay, so that explains the back and forth answer I get.
Yeah.
Because it sounds to me that it's dependent on strata and geology.
It does. And one thing to note is that the Wainimi is a pretty transmissive aquifer, but the Oxnard is more transmissive, so you probably get better flushing.
I see. Thank you.
We have had presented somewhere in my memory banks that once you have saltwater intrusion in a significant way from the ocean, that it is very difficult to push it back out because it is heavy and all of that with fresh water.
Yes.
Okay.
But I think it's dependent on the specific hydraulic properties of the aquifer, because we see here the one well, goes from 20,000 down to less than 5,000, but then back up again when the conditions are right. So the more transmissive, I think, the more possibility of recovery, or at least dilution.
Any other questions from the board?
And just a comment, based on that's my concern about making very broad-based management decisions on, say, a groundwater level or, say, a chloride level, when we can see that there's great variation in the geologic strata and transmissivity of these aquifers. Yes, we know we have a seawater intrusion problem and have for a long time, but I think we have to approach this in a common sense fashion.
Well, seawater is replacing storage, and it is very complicated. It's very heterogeneous, and you may have tongues that are, places where it's going much farther inland, and I don't know that we have it adequately defined at this point.
Understood. And if you happen to pick that well that had the seawater going in 10 miles versus 2 miles, you might be led to think that we've got a greater problem in that area, or vice versa. It's just not simple, is what I'm pointing at, and that seems to be what you're telling us here.
Directors, United, of course, does a lot of work monitoring the seawater intrusion and has for a long time. They publish a report. I think it's biannual. I think it's every other year or occasional, and they recently came out with one earlier this year. And of course, the United technical staff are very actively involved with the technical advisory group. If you want to take a deep dive into that, maybe that's something that your board would want to invite United to come discuss. But I can tell you that the ad hoc TAG committee meetings that I was talking about, where they were looking at the sustainability indicators, this is exactly what they were looking at. What wells are the best sentinel wells to monitor the movement of the seawater intrusion, what water levels are going to need to be in there. That will be the wells and the water levels are the measurable objectives. The interim milestones are where those are going to need to be every 5 years to meet the sustainability goals. And both water levels, I think, are being considered, as well as confirmed with chloride monitoring. The water levels, I think they're finding, are probably a better and more easier to monitor proxy for the intrusion, because because of the strata, the chloride levels can move out in different rates, just as you're talking about. So on a technical basis, that's something the technical advisory group is diving into deeply.
One other question, and that is, this presentation we saw is the presentation that was presented. So now the presentation is going to be presented tonight at Las Posas. Will that be presented to us at the next meeting? Is that what's going to happen?
It can be this was kind of an abridged version of the one that was presented last Wednesday, and if your board desires the same thing, a summary abridged version of the Las Posas one.
I would recommend it. I mean, it's good for all the board members to at least get this abridged version.
That I'll tell you after I see it. Any other questions from the board?
Okay, so this is the third part of this discussion. That's to kind of wrap up what we've got to do to bring this GSP home, look at the schedule, your board schedule, and the schedule of things that we need to do. Could you have them bring up that, I think it's 4C slide set. So as you can see, there's been a lot of momentum, a lot of work that is getting done, and we're really into the meat of things now. But these are some of the remaining tasks that need to be completed to finish the GSPs. And so the water budgets you saw presented, those are getting pretty mature with the data we have available. Management areas was something that was brought up in the DUDEC discussion. Now, management areas have been fairly well talked about in terms of Las Posas. There are some obvious management areas to consider in the Oxnard, like the Forebay, but maybe there's different things that need to happen there. You also heard in DUDEC's talk that maybe some parts of Pleasant Valley Basin on the other side of faults that are less connected, maybe they need to be managed a little bit differently. So those management areas have to be flushed out, identified, and presented to your board so that your board can agree with that. The sustainable management criteria, which Jill talked about quite a lot, and in terms of she touched on the fact that Sigma says that the 6 undesirable results, also known as the sustainability indicators, they have to define what is the significant and unreasonable undesirable result, and that's a local decision. In our workshops, we've developed it's kind of simplistic, but it's a survey, just to kind of survey stakeholders' ideas of where they see the most significant issues in their mind. It helps to also build an awareness to it, but that'll be coming to your board it's ultimately your board's decision as to what is a significant and unreasonable, undesirable result. And but it, of course, has to pass the straight face test with DWR. They're not going to say, we'll just let the seawater invade and go home. We've talked a lot about the water supply and infrastructure projects to be included in the GSPs at this point in time, to include the additional yield that might come from that. There has to be some rudimentary feasibility analysis and cost understanding. For some of the projects, we'll be able to include them, and others will be added later in updates. monitoring networks, which we touched on. Where are these monitoring wells going to be? Where are we going to monitor? We know that we're going to need additional monitoring networks after the GSP's there, because we don't have a huge amount of dedicated monitoring wells, and we'll have to put some in some strategic places. And so that'll be presented to your board as well as part of that. Coordination agreements. Interbasin, this is part of DUDEC's work scope once the draft GSPs are done, is to tie together the management of the basins within the GMA and how you manage them, because, of course, SGMA looks at these as discrete basins. And then intrabasin. These GSPs are for the entire DWR Bulletin 118 basin, which we've talked about before. There's fringe areas that were outside the GMA boundary. The county has filed as the GSA with the fringe areas with the idea of entering into an MOU for the GMA to manage those. And so that has to be wrapped up. And then, of course, Camarosa filed as a GSA, Camarosa Water District, in the areas of outside the GMA boundary in the Las Posas, Oxnard, and Pleasant Valley basins. And so we need to, this will be a much simpler coordination agreement than if they were doing their own groundwater sustainability plan. We understand that's not the case. Our GMA's groundwater sustainability plan will be there, but there needs to be a coordination agreement as to how those areas are managed. So looking at board meetings here through December, and the blue are regular board meetings, the orange are your scheduled special board meetings. The 11/10 is in red there with a question mark because the Veterans Day holiday is that Saturday, and so when we scheduled that at the beginning of the year, we didn't realize that's a day that it's closed. So that's actually an item that was on the addendum agenda to reschedule that. So you've gotten an introduction now to the water budgets, management areas, sustainable management criteria. We plan to come back at the October 13th special board meeting, which we recommend your board hold, to go into that discussion deeper. Then come back at the October 25th board meeting to talk about projects as well as any continuing items of discussion from the 11/13 meeting. And then, our current schedule is for us to come back with the draft GSPs for consideration in the November meeting, wherever that lands in November, that your board selects. I also list the tag meetings there, that the regular ones, there's one a month. There's a 10/19 that I've just somewhere around that time. That's not been something that we've scheduled with the tag yet, but we would need to have sometime in that time frame at least another tag meeting. Additionally, we'll talk about the next item, but it plays into the GSPs and the scheduling, the allocation discussions that will be coming to your board for the new allocation systems for Las Posas Valley and the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins, so you can see what we're projecting out there. There's some other board tasks that are ongoing. They just aren't all just before we get to the GSP, but just to give your board a heads up of the workload that is ahead of you. Continuing work on the water market. Arnie will get into that in detail in an upcoming item, but there is an ad hoc water market committee scheduled. AMI, any additional things that need to go back to the operations committee. Some point soon, probably after the first, we'll start talking more about the new data management system that we're going to have to develop that we've talked about. I don't know whether your board will want to send that to a subcommittee. Water supply and infrastructure projects. Once we start looking at those in detail, and especially after the GSPs are in effect, and we're able to get into the water supply side of things. Your board's talked about potential of appointing a stakeholder committee. I don't know whether we'd want to appoint a board committee or board members to that. Allocation, implementation, there may be some committee things that will need to be discussed there. And of course, there's the coordination agreements that will have to be developed. And then there will be, it's important to recognize that the GSPs are not a endpoint, they're not a destination, they're a milestone on a process, on a journey to get to sustainable groundwater management. And so there will be a significant amount of work scope that will need to be done after the GSPs are adopted to address the data gaps and uncertainty and optimize the management of the basin, maybe do some more very detailed scenarios of if we pump here and we don't pump there, or we put in pipelines here to move that around. Those kind of things are things that I think are going to be very helpful, but that's after we move forward with the GSP. So that just sort of gives a lookout. In terms of the schedule, your board's direction, when we started this whole process, of course, we didn't know that the United model would be available. It wasn't available. They didn't know when it was going to be available. And the direction was to use the available data we have, and that's what Sigma says, best available science, develop the first GSPs, and of course, recognizing that additional work's going to be needed to be done post-GSP. So TAG members have, especially as we get down into this home stretch and some of the things that Jill was talking about in terms of the uncertainty, some TAG members have expressed their concern with the level of uncertainty right now and the level of uncertainty and the ability to quantify that uncertainty under the current schedule and the real reliance on United's model, especially in Oxnard and Pleasant Valley. There is still some pending DWR guidance documents that's causing concern, although DWR has assured us that if we make reasonable assumptions, they're not going to reject our GSPs for that. They'll just want us to, any differences, address that in the 5-year update. And there's a range of opinions amongst the TAG members of how much uncertainty is an appropriate level of uncertainty to have in these first GSPs. And I'm hoping that some of the TAG members are here and will provide their comments to you so your board can consider that. In terms of the schedule, the models are the best tools for projecting 20 and 50-year sustainability. And the reason I say 50, we have to achieve sustainability in 20, but the plans are 50-year plans, have to look to maintain it over those next 50 years. The modeling's being done by outside agencies, and that's beyond the control of GMA. Although I did talk to United today, and they've indicated that they think they're going to be producing the documentation, finishing the West Los Postos portion of their model, and producing the documentation January, February timeframe. I caution that, and they would be the first to tell you as well, that those kinds of timeframes with modeling, you can get to these hiccups that just push things out. So that's they're fairly upbeat right now, but that's out of our control. Sigma recognizes there will be data gaps and uncertainty in the GSPs, and it requires that we as the GSA reduce those data gaps post-GSP. And of course, as I say, this is not a destination, it's a point on a process. They require regular updates and revisions at least every 5 years, although it allows agencies to revise a plan whenever it deems as it should. It doesn't have to be 5 years. And then another issue that we are chasing down is that DWRs has stated that they need the whole basin covered on the GSPs, and intra-basin coordination agreements to be part of that with the submittal to DWR. So,
If I could, before we leave that slide,
yeah.
Director West, I know that, one thing I just want to put out on the radar screen, I know that 2 years ago or so, we had some real challenges with United in terms of trying to get modeling data from them, et cetera, and there was lots of disagreements about whether they were going to give it to us ever or give it to us at all and all of that. So, I mean, to the extent that we have really smooth and good cooperation, that's one thing, but I think that it reminds us that with the important responsibility that we have to make sure we have good modeling that we have confidence in, that we should at least make sure we're always considering the option of finding a way to fund our own modeling, so that we're not dependent upon another agency, particularly if we're having any hiccups with that agency in terms of getting the data. So, not ready to do anything more than that except get it on the radar screen. It's something that should be considered by any agency that's taking on the significant responsibility that we're taking on here. Thank you.
So at this point, that's just the frame I wanted to put up there for your consideration. If you don't have any questions this time, I would invite whatever TAG members are present who want to address this issue. And I would like to thank TAG member Terry Foreman. He really pressed me he said he wanted to talk about this. I think it actually is a very healthy thing for us to bring here and discuss. So I appreciate that and invite Terry or
Brian, any comments? Anyone else?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Terry Foreman. I'm a member of the TAG working group here. Yeah, I do have a lot of comments, and I've been to pretty much all the GMA meetings for the most part over the last couple of years now, because I'm actually semi-retired, mostly retired. And although this is actually occupying more time than I thought. But anyway, I do have a lot of comments, and they really prompt me to do them. I've sort of bit my tongue the last couple of GMA meetings, hoping that maybe we'd have a little reality into the schedule process here, because I attended the stakeholder meeting the other night on the Oxnard PV, where it was stated that the GSPs are going to be out in November, and as Kim just illustrated, the schedule still shows shows the GSPs being out in December. And given what I know, participating in the TAG process, I was quite shocked to believe that that was still the case.
Could I just, the way I read it, that the draft was going to be out in November in this chart that I saw up there. It's going to be the
correct.
final adoption in December, but the drafts would be out in November. Now, you just said.
You're correct. That's correct.
But you just said, you looked and said the draft's not going to be out until December.
Well, November, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
maybe I misspoke. But regardless, December, November, even this year, I was shocked to believe that that's still the case, given what I know about the status of the information. So I actually have some handouts for the board, if I may, give them to the clerk that she can share with the board. And then one for the executive. And I appreciate Kim taking to heart our conversation and adding more to the board presentation. But before I get into my comments, I don't know most of the board members very well, and I don't know a lot of the audience members very well. So I just want to take a moment to sort of give you a perspective on where I'm coming from. Basically, I've got 40 years of experience doing hydrogeology, groundwater resources work. Actually, for my master's thesis, almost 40 years to the year ago, I actually started developing a three-dimensional groundwater flow model to assess an alluvial aquifer system and river interaction. Who would have knew? But anyway, developing that three-dimensional model, I actually coded the model. It wasn't like I took some model and applied it. I actually coded the model from scratch, starting with the governing groundwater flow equations, turning them to numerical code, and then moving to apply it to this groundwater situation. And after I got the code written and was looking at applying it, the USGS comes out with a three-dimensional groundwater flow model. So I decided to scratch where I was at and use that because it had more capabilities than my model did. But anyway, with that though, I like to understand what it is I'm actually applying. Being from Missouri, I guess it's got to be the show me in me. But anyway, I did find an error in their calculation of harmonic mean of transmissivity. I wrote the author, and he thanked me very much and asked me to inform him of any other errors that I found. So anyway, that's kind of where I started. And then I moved on to looking at groundwater flow in permafrost regions up in North Slope of Alaska, where groundwater basically occurs where the permafrost has been thawed, but we dealt with more complex situations of change in state. That is, the aquifer actually freezes in the winter season, and so got into simulating that because we wanted to look at groundwater being thrust to the surface because of freezing aquifer systems. Then after that, I moved on to groundwater modeling, three-dimensional groundwater modeling of looking at the disposal of high-level nuclear waste in salt domes in the Gulf Coast states. And did that for a few years and kind of got tired of doing so much hypothetical stuff that I wanted to get down to solving real-world problems. And so I moved into the next 30 years of my experience was really developing three-dimensional groundwater flow models in the Southwest and predominantly in Southern California, and developed probably some of the first three-dimensional groundwater flow models in most of the groundwater basins in Southern California. And also was an expert witness in 2 coastal groundwater basins. So dealing with this seawater intrusion issue, which is very tricky in terms of really calibrating groundwater models for those conditions. And then spent a lot of time in the West Coast Basin and getting at the issue of can you move saltwater intrusion or seawater intrusion around. They actually trapped 600,000 acre-feet of seawater intrusion into the West Coast Basin when they installed the injection barrier. So we were simulating that and how to get that salt out of there. But we also looked at replacing the use of imported water into the injection barrier with recycled water. So we not only had to calibrate the model for heads, that is the groundwater levels, but we had to calibrate the model for groundwater flow. How fast does the groundwater actually move through the groundwater basin? Because we were subject to regulatory requirements that had transient times associated with that. How long is that recycled water going to be in the ground before it's actually extracted back out? So much more complicated than just matching water levels, if you will. Fortunately, we had the information on the water that we injected, which was imported water. We had the difference between groundwater, imported water, and salt water, so we could actually distinguish where it was, and we could actually test our groundwater model in terms of its accuracy, in terms of actually simulating groundwater flow in the basin. So, and it was successful in that we got the permit to use recycled water for injection. And then after about 2000, one of the, I'd say, big things that we started seeing differently and I started doing differently was the use of soil moisture budget modeling, which basically looks at when precipitation and applied water for lawn irrigation or ag irrigation, how much of that makes it into the groundwater basin. And fortunately, I worked in a big company and had the opportunity to work with soil scientists and ag engineers who are looking at applied water requirements for ag crops, if you will. And I got to work with them, and it's like, they kind of calculated this term deep percolation, and they didn't care kind of what happened to it. They just wanted to estimate how much water they need to apply to the crop and kind of the leaching fraction, et cetera. And I said, well, I'm interested in your residual, which was the deep percolation. And so we combined the two and combined those with groundwater models to really improve our estimate of the recharge from precipitation and deep percolation into our groundwater models. And that's been a trend in the industry. Department of Water Resources actually now has released a model that does that. It's called IDC. And I actually brought that to the TAG, which kind of prompted us to go a direction that we did. So I want you to recall that because, or remember that, because I'm going to come back to that in some of my comments that are written here today. So first of all, I'm going to turn to my outline that I presented to the board here. And the audience unfortunately doesn't have this, but I'll just do it verbally. So we've heard a lot about uncertainty, and that we're not going to reduce all this uncertainty that we're dealing with. And I just want the board to understand there's really two types of uncertainty that we're looking at here. And if you recall the graph that was up here a few minutes ago about the uncertainty, you saw this huge band of uncertainty that was up to the top of the graph, almost down to the bottom of the graph out to 2020. And then there was a point in the middle. And that point in the middle is called the expected value. But the range could be from the top of the graph to the bottom of the graph. And I'm concerned that we're confusing uncertainty to data gaps with uncertainty due to lack of assessments of existing data. And I think we owe it to the community and stakeholders to make our best estimate of the sustainable yield of the groundwater basins with the information that we have at our disposal. We do have a lot of information. I know Director Bennett has mentioned we've been operating for 30 years. We have 30 years of data that we ought to be able to use to really squeeze out our understanding of what's going on in the groundwater basins. Personally, in my experience, I think we can narrow the uncertainty if we analyze the data we have rather than kick the can down the road and analyze it the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the next 20 years, whatever. So I've attached a graph to your packet. There's two graphs. And for the audience, they have one that's on the front and one in the back. I'm going to discuss the first one, which is the one that's kind of the wide, short graph. That's, and these are hypothetical examples, but illustrate a point I'd like to make. And so the y-axis is the probability of that value, and the x-axis, which goes left to right, you see the numbers at the bottom, 20,000, 60,000, 80,000. And the one in the middle is typically what we consider the best or expected value, which is typically the 50% probability that that's the value that it actually is. And then there's error bars on that, which are standard deviations. And so the uncertainty about that expected value is due to data gaps and data analysis of information. And my fear is that we're basically looking at this situation. So this is the error bars presented in the graph that we've been looking at in these previous presentations, except turned sideways. So this would be the bottom of the range and top of the range as shown on the graph, with the middle bar being that middle point on the graph. And so that broad range is due to both data gaps, data that we need to collect or data we don't have, but also due to insufficient analysis of the data we have because we don't want to take the time to really analyze it and squeeze what we can in terms of the data to better our understanding. Now, I would propose that it shouldn't be that wide, that we shouldn't have a range of uncertainty that goes from the top to the bottom, and that we really have what's on the second graph, that if we take out the uncertainty due to our lack of addressing or analyzing the existing information that we have, that we should be able to squeeze that uncertainty, increase the probability of of the expected value, or better bracket that expected value and have a much narrower range of what that yield value is. So I just want to make sure you understand that, and in my opinion, we're looking at moving forward with the situation of the broader range of uncertainty, because we don't want to take the time to really squeeze what we can from the existing information, and also use the models that are being developed or in process of nearly developed to really understand the information we have.
Excuse me, Terry, I know you mentioned deep percolation, but apart from that, are there any other issues?
Going to item number 2.
Okay. I mean, are there any others that, for which we have adequate data that we haven't adequately analyzed?
I could take that whole pie chart, and which I think we should do, and what I would propose to do is we take every element of that pie chart and say, how well do we understand it? Because there's some things that aren't on the pie chart that also affect what those values could be. For example, flow between the upper aquifers to the lower aquifers. Right now, there's estimates of how much flow goes from the what's called the semi-perch zone, or the topmost aquifer that's really not pumped, but represents a lot of water that's in the models and in the water budget calculations that are being done that have been left out of the pie charts that you've seen. So there's another whole piece of the water budget out there that we haven't been talking about. And for example, there's an estimate from the United model, for example, of about 20,000 acre feet of water that goes into that upper aquifer and then gets discharged to drains. But we don't have any measurements of what that is. But 20,000 acre feet, that's a huge number that either one represents a potential source of supply, or number two, if it's not really going all to drains, potentially is going into the aquifer system. And thus we'd be underestimating the amount of water that's really in the aquifer system. So there's other uncertainties in terms of how much water is going from the upper aquifers down to the lower aquifers, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So to answer your question, Chair, I would say that all those water budget components are subject to an uncertainty analysis. How confident are we in each one of those numbers, and can we better quantify or at least describe what the uncertainty is associated with each of those numbers? And we've been started to talk about this in TAG, but all these numbers are pretty recent. Kim's right. We've really just started getting into the meat of all this since we started in March. We had more discussions in May. We kind of focused a shift to creating a water level contour map for 2015 over the last 2 or 3 months, which is a long time to create water level maps. But anyway, we haven't really fully discussed the individual components of this water budget, and I think it merits some discussion. Now, United probably has a lot more evaluation of them.
If I could follow up, so your proposal would be to take all of those things in the pie chart and define them more accurately.
Evaluate them in terms of how well do we understand each of these numbers, right, and how much uncertainty may be associated with each number.
And the second thing is you just made the statement 2 or 3 months was a long time to do the water flow models?
No. Groundwater level contour maps.
Yeah, contour maps.
Right. We have 1 year of 2015, March and October, that we spent 2 or 3 months contouring water levels.
And can you tell me why we spent 2 or 3 months on that?
I can't, because I wasn't doing it. I just reviewed the product. That seemed to take quite a bit of time to get out. And I'll let the consultant answer that if they'd like. But I know part of it was data, getting data together from all the different sources, and then.
So that took longer than you thought it should take.
Oh yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. So then what do I think are some of the items that we just talked about in terms of this sort of lack of understanding, uncertainty component? First, unfinished work creates some of this unnecessary uncertainty that I talk about. And I use an example here, recharge from precipitation and applied water. Over the last 2 years, we've had at least 3 estimates, one by United, one by the previous consultant, and one by the current consultant. And they vary by over 15,000 acre feet a year. Not 15,000 acre feet plus or minus. The highest estimate to the next estimate is 15,000 acre feet difference. So that's potentially 15,000 acre feet of more water. And so the GMA hired Daniel B. Stevens and Associates as a sub-consultant to DUDEC to estimate recharge, and you authorized $180,000 to do that. That work was basically to do what I described earlier in terms of estimating deep percolation from applied water, that is ag irrigation water, municipal irrigation water, and recharge from precipitation, which is kind of where things have moved in terms of the standard for the industry. They did some other things like this estimating and change in storage and looking at water levels and so on, but the major element was really to better understand what the potential recharge from deep percolation of those sources were. So they provided us a draft in March, and we had lots of questions about the results that were presented, and the consultant came back and says, well, some of the things you're asking for are out of scope. We would like additional funds in order to address your questions. And basically, the GMA staff told us that they weren't going to authorize any additional work and just treat the work as an uncertainty. Well, we'll just, whatever they provided, we'll just deal with that as an uncertainty and put that off for future analysis. We spent 3 months going back and forth on why that can't be resolved. It was a request for about $43,000, as I recall, but I pointed out that about half of that should have been in the original budget, so really we're only talking about $20-some thousand of additional budget to finish the work. Anyway, that's kind of where that stands. As far as I know, it's still not done. They did do another iteration, which was actually useful. I plan to bring that for discussion at the TAG on next week. And as Kim mentioned, DWR still have not released several guidance documents on sustainability criteria, the climate change data sets, and at least I haven't. I don't know if any other TAG members have been informed as to how any of that's going to be addressed in the GSP. How we're going to handle climate change. Kim did mention that you can come in with a proposal and DWR will consider it, but it hasn't been run by TAG yet. And yet in 2 months, there's going to be a draft GSP.
And I don't mean to cut you off, but let me cut to the chase if I can. Is what you're telling me is that you don't think that there's enough time left between now and November for TAG to do what we've asked you to do?
Absolutely.
Because I think we got the message based on, I mean, the science is fascinating, but this isn't the forum for that. Why don't you explain that just so that it's clear?
Explain
what it is, I guess, explain as briefly as you can what the challenges are for TAG in order to be able to complete its mission by November.
Well, there's several components. I also have in your packet the schedule, the list of work that needs to be done. If you look at the back, the last few pages of your handout, there's a couple of pages, 5 pages, that are just the outline elements of work that needs to be completed. This is from the outline that we're working against to prepare the GSPs. And so I highlighted in green, maybe that's what you're getting at, is if you look at the highlighted items in green, basically the historical water budget, we've been talking about that, but we just got the draft, for example, on Las Posas Monday night, I believe it was. So we're going to review that for the first time starting Monday night. We've had lots of questions and issues that need to be addressed on the Oxnard PV basins. So then you've got in task 2.4.3, the projected water budget, which is for a 50-year projection, which you're supposed to look at land use, how much water gets used, where that water's coming from to meet all the demands, municipal, M&I, et cetera, pumping, and do analysis for 50 years in terms of how that impacts the sustainability of the groundwater basin. And then management areas, Kim brought that up. There has to be agreements on these management areas, which, as he pointed out, there's actually a couple of new ones, several new ones actually, that have been added since we started all this. And then project and actions. As Kim mentioned, there is a subcommittee starting to talk about potential projects, but that just started. I don't know how we're going to determine which projects would potentially be implemented, how they would get funded, what would be the implementation mechanism, how does the stakeholders provide input to that whole process, et cetera. So basically there is a lot of work to do, and we've got 2 TAG meetings left, basically next week and first week in November, even if we scheduled one every week. There's no way that I think we could get through all this with any kind of credibility. So I just, and there's a point that I make on item 5 where I go back to point 1. There's a lot of folks out there doing good work that want to do projects, and how do we evaluate those? You know, what does this mean to the City of Camarillo's project? If we look at what water levels are doing, water levels have dropped 60 or 80 feet since they analyzed their project up in that area. The Moore Park desalter, how does that get evaluated? Proposed water supply projects, what's the efficacy of those projects? I understand those can be evaluated later, but how far do we kick this down the road? And we kind of started this process with that was the goal, was to be able to evaluate these projects, and we're going to leave it at the same spot that we started. So I have a challenge understanding what have we gained over the last 2 years. And we have been doing this for over 2 years now, and unfortunately we fired the last consultant. I claim that probably cost us a year because it took 4 or 5 months to go through that process, and the consultant essentially started from scratch. So all that work that was done basically got thrown away, and we lost all that time. So let me just wrap up by saying one other thing in my experience. I had the opportunity to work with a fellow named Bill Walton. Bill Walton was the author of a book called Water Resources Evaluation. It was really the Bible for evaluating water resources. He was retired, and brought him in, had a nice breakfast, got in the car, and he said, I just want to tell you boys one thing. I really enjoy this, working with folks like you in terms of trying to solve some of these really challenging problems. But I'm going to tell you what I think. And if you don't like it, I've got a garden in my backyard that I enjoy just as much doing. And I guess I'm sort of at the same point. If you want to hear what I have to say, I'm going to tell you. And if you don't like it, well, I'm fine doing other things. I said I'm retired. So, but I appreciate the opportunity, and I do want to comment that the team is working well together. It is going well. I think we're making good progress. I know Cayugas supposedly, as I understand it, is finishing their model and actually is ready to bring it to TAG, which will allow us to integrate the 2 efforts and will be a very good tool to analyze a lot of the questions. The one that Director Bennett brought up about, you know, what's the potential damage if we continue pumping for the next 10, 15 years? You know, if you got an uncertainty of 40,000 acre feet, which number are we going to use to do that evaluation on? The 40,000 acre foot or the 80,000 acre foot? Or both? And then throw it at you to figure it out. So anyway, I'll stop there. I hope I answered your question.
You did. Thank you. Thank you. Brian, did you have any comments?
I have a question for
you. Oh, by all means.
I just have one question for you. I note in here And I only had just a short time to try to review this, but I noted in here, most of the things that you brought up are areas where you think the uncertainty, it has been estimated as low, and the uncertainty would err on there would be more water if we did more analysis. Can you identify what are you identifying what are the significant areas where you think staff has overestimated the amount of water and it's actually going to be less than that?
Potentially losses from Caneo Creek, and then as was brought up earlier, the underflow from East Las Posas into Pleasant Valley. That number was presented as potentially a high number, and it's probably lower. So that needs to be evaluated. And I think we can narrow what that number actually is.
Thank you.
Well, okay, let's follow along that. Let me ask the next part of that question then. If that number is low, are you then also contesting what is the total number, or is it just whereabouts that water is in the equation?
Both. Because it can move. Some of that water was actually used as applied water that wasn't accounted for. It was right now, it'd be assumed it was available for deep percolation, but I know for a fact that that water was actually taken out and applied for irrigation purposes. So it's still in there, it's just in the wrong spot potentially, and would reduce the amount of deep percolation by somewhat.
And by extension then throw off the entire water balance number.
Sure. The magnitude may not be significant in that particular case. But the other, I didn't mention because Chair West asked me to answer a question, but the other big concern I have is this 300,000 acre feet of seawater intrusion that's purported from the models.
Actually, 350.
Okay, it's a big number, and I think before we tell the community that's what the number is, we ought to look at that a lot more closely. And maybe it has been, and I'm just not aware of that. I saw the graphs that were presented here, but I have a question. You know, if I look at what I see in the chlorides and I look at what's been developed for groundwater gradients, you know, again, I'm not going to do all the work. But I look at it, and in my experience, that just seems high. So I'd like to validate that with as much observational data as we can, and we could actually run the model, and we can do a thing called pathline tracking, which would basically show how far particles would move inland through simulation of the model. And if that goes way beyond what we observe in terms of chloride, then we know the model is probably overestimating the flow. If you remember in West Coast Basin, the work that we did, we had to match the heads, but we also had to match the flow. And while you would think the two would go together, it's not necessarily the case. So I think before we say there's 300,000 acre feet of seawater intrusion that has occurred, let's do what we can to validate that. And I don't think we're talking about a huge amount of work. I'm actually going to make some recommendations to the TAG next week as to how we could evaluate that and maybe get a little better confidence on that number. Because again, I think some of this deep percolation may be moving deeper than what may be being simulated. And we can do some evaluation of that to assess whether or not that might be the case. So we're trading off, if there is more deep percolation, there's probably less seawater intrusion. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. I understand what you're saying. I guess for me as a board member feeding back to you, I do appreciate the effort that you put in here. No, I don't want you to go away. I'm not necessarily in total agreement with you with what you've written up and what you've put here. But as a board member that will be evaluating this plan that will be presented in somewhere between 2 and 6 months, maybe a year, is the underlying assumptions on which the plan is based, are they sound? I don't need to know and get into the weeds at this point as to what is every molecule of water, what is the, so long as the mass numbers are in place for me to understand where's the general trend that we're going. Are we generally trending down? And if so, what are my options in order to put in place in order to address that?
I think you need to take it a step further. We're trending? What's causing the trend? Is it because which of those components are affecting that trend? Because we're going to make projections, and if we don't have these components correct, we may make a projection that's wrong because we assumed this component was this big when in fact it's this big. This component was this big, but it's no longer available for whatever reason. For example, taking water out of the creeks. So we make a projection based on a wrong assumed or wrong calibrated value, if you will. So all of our projections are going to be potentially wrong.
Okay. So my response back to that is, isn't this an adaptive management plan, a living document that we'll
Absolutely.
be receiving regular updates on?
Absolutely.
And every 5 years, we're to, for lack of a better word, true up with what the new information is and make the adjustments?
Yes.
So why do I, as a board member, have to have this range of uncertainty narrowed down to the level of which you're saying? If I know, or if I'm told that the Oxnard Basin is somewhere between 60 and 80,000 in its safe yield, and that's where we're going to start off with, and the Las Posas Basin is somewhere 30, 35,000, okay? Now we're at a number, and we think we're going to have to go this direction. Why is me sitting as a board member here setting policy worrying about the weeds and not just let you go back and do rock, paper, scissors as to who's right?
I'm not sure I quite follow you're basically saying you've got a number that's a range.
As a board member, I'm going to be looking at generalities. I'm not going to get down in the weeds in order to check exactly what's behind it.
Right.
You're going to lose me. So, but you are experts out there in order to drive that, and over the next 20 years, you're going to be developing it. Why do I have to have that range of certainty now?
Because you're going to be making some big decisions, and some of these projects take 20 years to implement.
But these big decisions are started on generalities. They're not on certainties. They're to set us in a path, not to absolutely drive us to a location. I want to get from here back east. I'm going to start driving east. I don't know if I'm going to take the 8, the 10, the 15, or the 40, or the I-90, but I'm going to start heading that direction.
If you take the wrong road, you may just go south into Mexico.
But that's where I see this first step being, is that we're just heading in a general direction, and we're going to fine-tune that as more information comes available.
And I guess my response is where do we start that point? Do we start it with such a broad range? And the difference may be, are we at 60 or are we at 80? And is the range really around 80 as opposed to 60?
Okay.
I think that may make a big impact on where you go and where the community may want to go. I don't know.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you.
Brian?
I'll attempt to be brief. For the record, Brian Bondi, I am Director Borchard's representative on TAG. I just jotted down some thoughts while I was listening to the presentation, so this is by no means going to be as eloquent as Terry. Some of the things that came to mind, Sigma's new. This is a new process, and we're figuring out how to sort through this process. We're the first in the state, and we're leading the charge. There's no DWR best management practice for how to manage the development of GSP or work with a technical advisory group. We should probably write that BMP and send it to DWR because we're figuring it out as we go. DUDEC, I believe, is at a point now where they have their arms around the data, and I really feel like they have their feet under them and are now running. And that's a good thing because they're capable of doing very good work, and they're doing very good work. We've figured out how DUDEC and TAG can interact more effectively, and so we're working better together as a team. I want to echo some of Terry's concepts about data gaps and the difference between a data gap and doing the best we can with the data we have. Certainly, there will undoubtedly be data gaps that we will be addressing probably in perpetuity. I'm not here today to say that we have to address all of those data gaps before a GSP is done. By no means is that my expectation or even what DWR or the legislature expected when they wrote the legislation. I think our charge is to do the best we can with the data we have. I think that's clear in the regulations. And DWR regulations talk about best available science with the data you have, and that's what they expect. And I believe that's the charge tag has been given, is to make sure that we, with the consultant, are making sure we're doing best available science. Now, best available science doesn't mean that we need to be analyzing things in the right-hand direction of the decimal point. I believe we need to be left of the decimal point, looking at whole numbers here. And that's where I'd like to be with this. So I'm not here today to suggest that necessarily we look at all those different elements on the pie charts, but I think we should take a closer look at some of the larger elements on those pie charts and make sure we understand what we know and what we don't know, because it's those bigger pieces of the pie chart that are really going to drive the sustainable yield and how we manage the basin. I think we have an opportunity to narrow the starting or baseline understanding of the basins from which we will adapt. I think that's important. The better your baseline is, the less adaptation you have to do, the less uncertainty that you are going to have translated into landowners and others' business planning moving forward. I think that's important to the stakeholders, and I'll expect that you will hear that from them at some point in the process. At least that's the feedback I'm getting from the folks I talk to. Doing the best with the data we have, maybe I can give you just one example. Jill, what was the number for the loss of storage, freshwater and seawater? Around 20,000 acre feet per year? I think it was, then you added the seawater and it was closer to 20. So that number, let's just call it 20. We'll round up to 20,000. That's an estimate of how much less we'd have to pump to be sort of at an even water balance. We need to pump a little bit less than that to get water levels to rise. Another number that was presented in the presentation was a sustainable yield of about 60,000. Current pumping in the basins is 100, 110. So that would suggest that we would need to reduce 40 to 50,000 acre feet per year. So here, just as an example, we have two numbers, 20,000, 50,000. I'm here today to say we should try and work to get that a little bit narrowed. That's a pretty wide range to be moving forward with in uncertainty. And I think we can do better with not a lot of extra effort. Given the schedule that Kim laid out, you saw on his slide, there's a lot of work to do. That slide was full, and all those things need to be done. With the schedule that's laid out, just the simple reality is, as speaking for myself, not on behalf of all the TAG, I will not be able to review all of that. And I would imagine that Terry's retired, maybe he can review it all. I can't, and I would imagine most of the other TAG members will not be able to review it. And even if we did, we won't do the job that I think Chair West, you asked us to do when you came and addressed us. So that's really the concern from my perspective, is making sure I do my job, the charge that I've been given, and I can't do that with the schedule that we have. One last point, Kim had a slide that said models are the best tools for evaluating, I don't remember the exact words, but sustainability and projects. And particularly what models allow us to do is ask questions. If we do this project, how's that going to affect the sustainability yield, the sustainability indicators, and what it allows us to look at the cost benefit of different projects. That's the value, or one of the values you get out of models. And I believe that's the reason DWR in the regulations and the BMPs, they don't say you have to use a model, but they pretty much said everything except you have to use a model, and that's the reason why. I think we would have a better baseline if we can get to a point with the United and Cayugas models that we're using them in the GSP. I think that will give us a more stable baseline moving forward. In terms of the Cayugas model, that model I've indicated to Kim is ready for TAG review. Cayugas is open to, is actually asked for the model to be taken through the TAG process. And actually, we've reached out to your staff to see if they are interested in cost sharing and being a fiscal partner in completing that model and actually being, a part owner of that model. And so that speaks to the concerns that Director Bennett had earlier. And I believe, talking with Susan, Cayugas remains open to that idea. So the message here is we're ready to work with the agency with the modeling if that's indeed what you'd like to do to get a better baseline with the GSPs. I'll answer any questions.
Thank you, Brian. Any questions from the general public? Questions, comments?
We have one more tag member.
Oops. Sit too far back and I'll never know you're there.
Good afternoon, Board Chairman West and board members. My name is Jim Otusa. I represent the County of Ventura Board of Supervisors on the TAG Committee. I just have a few things. First, Terry may be right with all of the uncertainties. There are a lot of uncertainties here. And we are starting from a point which actually is better than we've probably been. DUDEC's done a good job with presenting some data. There are a lot of data gaps. To refer to the pie chart, which we all refer to, the GSP is our starting point. So the more we narrow down those uncertainties at the starting point, the better we'll be 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. That's pretty much understood. But we can take what we have and develop which things we think have the most uncertainty and then focus our evaluation to those points. Mimicking Brian, the schedule is aggressive. And the DWR, some of their points or BMPs are not out to us yet, so it's hard to address them when we don't have them in front of us. I'm here for any questions. That's all I wanted to iterate.
Are you saying we should take more time?
I'm saying if we go forward with the schedule Kim has laid out, we will have more uncertainty than we may want. That doesn't mean over time, because it's a starting point, we can't narrow down that uncertainty in a priority-based method.
So you're saying that if we go forward, then we put a priority basis on the various uncertainties and start working on those?
Uncertainties we believe have the most potential for uncertainty.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Chair West, Board, before you move it to public comment, I would just like to say, since Terry brought to my attention they intended to make these comments, I have reached out and I've talked to all the TAG members, including those that weren't here. And I would say there's certainly a very big range of opinion as to how much analysis needs to get done up front before the GSPs first GSPs are done, and then we move forward with additional analysis. But I will say that the majority of the TAG represented to me that they think that the current schedule is going to be very challenging to get the kind of review done and work analysis that they think they would feel most comfortable with, although I think the majority also feel that maintaining an aggressive, sort of a modified aggressive schedule would be the best approach, not to analyze out to the nth decimal place as Brian had kind of characterized it.
Thank you, Kim. I guess my only comment is uncertainty doesn't bother me. As you've heard before, I've got 3 daughters. Nothing in life is certain. But apart from that, what does concern me is that if our schedule prevents us from critically analyzing the data we have, whether it's simply to reduce uncertainty or to make use of the best available science as mandated by the statute, that would concern me. And so I'll be open to whatever recommendations staff returns with concerning that schedule, as long as the recommendations are designed to give staff and TAG the time they need to analyze that data, to squeeze the data, so that we put out the best possible product. Yes.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, just from a staff perspective, I would share with you that I understand from a technical perspective their discomfort with ranges. But as you pointed out, I think a number of your boards, you're used to working in ranges. What you have here is the collision of what is going to be public policy, economics, state mandates, schedule time, and projects that we're trying to get to. You'll see in the next item, I believe, or you'll start to see in the next item, that this has been taken into consideration in the recommendations that we'll be bringing forward to you on allocation systems. In other words, nobody's proposing starting at 60,000 or at 80,000 in pumping in the Oxnard Plain. That would create a number of economic hardships. The recommendations we're going to be bringing you will factor in that uncertainty. And your board's going to, whether we have the decimal points or not, I would submit to you that your board's probably going to have to consider working higher to start with anyway. We've talked with the stakeholders, and they're looking for this ramp down. And what you're trying to do, it seems, or what we staff are recommending you do, is just create this crash pad, if you will, so that there's no cliffs to fall off of, and the ramp is not, we're minimizing the steepness of the ramp down to whatever sustainable yield is. And we're looking at 20 plus years here with intervals that will be at your board's determination, modification intervals. And so what we're starting out with is essentially, or staff's proposing, a version 1.0. And there will be what I'll call the 1.1s, 1.2s at your board's discretion as we adapt and move through the planning. And then there will be the version 2.0s where things change tremendously because we have filled a data gap or we've done research, we have further data. So just as an overarching principle, we understand that if you're a technical person, that public policy intersection, the schedule intersection can make you nervous, but there are reasons why your board might want to consider moving forward with that uncertainty. So just overarching and in preparation for the next item.
Chair West, if I could, first I just want to be fair to Mr. Foreman when the suggestion was made that, there's a request for more data. I think that he accurately said he wants to make a distinction between data gaps and the analysis of the data that we have out there. And the second thing I want to say is I appreciate your patience for trying to get it right, and your patience for all this volunteer service that you're doing. It's very evident and obvious. I would say that it is every time that the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency has approached a deadline for a hard decision, we have had a request for delay, and I would so it's not surprising that we have that at this point in time. Whether this is an appropriate request or not, I think it's what we have to analyze. But we should put it in the context that there's almost always somebody out there suggesting that we not take action. But I would point out part of why we're here and part of how we got here was we have emergency ordinance E that says we've got a real problem here. And we basically have said we won't do anything. We put in the irrigation efficiency, which everybody I think is recognizing is not really working. And we said we'll live with it not working because we're getting ready to do this plan. And so if we're going to delay, not do this schedule, I think that I will advocate hard, and I think you have to make a strong case that then we better do something else in the interim because we can't, we kick this can down the road for this reason here. Now, the question is this request for delay appropriate? And I would offer that if you take that pie chart, as Mr. Foreman suggested, and we go through and we reanalyze each one of those numbers, when they are done with that process, I will guarantee you somebody else can come along and say, if you take those new numbers, we could refine those even better if you give us more time. And so the essential question is the refining of those numbers essential and important for us to come up with this first version of the plan? right? And I would offer to you that if you, I would offer to you that I haven't heard the evidence of that being the case, because I appreciate you saying, you know, do they have enough time to do the work that we want them to do? What the first thing that I want them to do is to say, should we head east or should we head west, right? Okay, and that's what we need to know, right? Should we head east or west? Are we in good shape and we don't need to be doing cuts, or do we have to be doing cuts? Now, the analogy was used, and the response was, well, you could be going south. Well, if this plan is taking us south when we need to be going east, that's a fair question. But I have heard no one say, you know what, we really shouldn't be planning for some kind of supply augmentation and some kind of ramp down, right? Everybody is saying that. So the plan is going in the right direction. Now, to the extent that there is data out there that could be refined better, my sense is our direction to our TAG members, with whatever volunteer energy you have and volunteer time you have, pick the most important things and get that done in the next 2 months. Because nobody has presented to me the thing that is, wow, if we did this better and got it more precise, we would stop heading east and we'd go west. Right? So that's an important point that I would like to make. The second thing I would offer is this. If you take Mr. Foreman's chart, we basically have greater uncertainty than what he would propose. He'd say more, be more precise. Now, he has chosen the number of 80K if we're more precise. But I would offer to you, from what I see, and I'm not the technical person, but if I had to see, one of the biggest uncertainties out there is we showed that we had an average of over 40,000 acre feet of recharge on average from the Fox Canyon diversion. And everybody knows that is going to be significantly less than that with the new environmental guidelines out there. And yet we are starting with using the historical number. Am I correct? So we're starting with that historical number. So if you want to go get more precise, I'm going to suggest to you that more precision is going to have to be on both sides of the coin, not just the things that will raise this number, but the things that could potentially lower this number. And if those things all offset, and you come up with 60K as your number, but with less uncertainty, then you actually have to ramp down faster because you have less uncertainty. So you can't. So from a public policy standpoint, I just don't see any benefit in saying we've got to grind and delay when there are significant benefits from moving forward. One, we can start a replenishment fee. Two, we can start to be more clear and define. We're more likely to get version 2.0 if we get version 1.0 done. The other thing that so with that uncertainty out there, people need to realize if we're going to get more certain, then we're going to have to get more certain. And I've already seen what United has projected. And if we put those projections in instead of the historical, if we put those projections in, you got a lot bigger problem, I think, out there. And we don't have those in at this point in time. Whereas we can have a better chance to have more accuracy. Mr. Foreman brought up, how do we handle the issue of climate change? My gosh, we could debate that from now until the cows come home in terms of how do we handle the issue of climate change. It would take us forever. So I have no confidence that if we took more time, that we would actually come to agreement as to, oh yeah, this is it. This is as good as we can get the evaluation of this data. And so we would still have this potential out there. The final thing, then, the piece of evidence that was offered by Mr. Bondi, he said, because I'm looking for something that says, hey, we're making a major mistake here. We're going east when we should be going west. He said, hey, he used the thing that says, look, at right now we seem to be pumping at 110, and we're he says that number was closer to 50K when the model says 20K. Well, the model says 20K overall, not 20K for drought, but the model said 47K during the drought years. So there isn't, so if that's the piece of evidence that makes me say, whoa, we should put the brakes on, it's not, that one wasn't the convincing piece of evidence. But I would just remind this board, at every hard juncture, we will get the request for delay. We should always fairly evaluate those requests. But I certainly haven't seen anything that suggests to me we will make better public policy. We will make public policy later, and it will have to be with a potentially faster ramp down, which I think is more problematic for us than if we go with where we are right now and then ask the TAG to prioritize those areas that they want to put the limited amount of time they have. Because you don't have an unlimited amount of time ever for anything. And I can appreciate that technical people can always like to get more precise. And we as policymakers have to consider many variables in here as we go forward. So I appreciate that we have a schedule. The schedule's already slipped quite a bit from what we originally had laid out with this schedule to try to give it more time. I think we should move forward and prioritize then what do we work on after as we're moving forward with this schedule. Thank you very much.
Charlotte, did you?
No.
Any other comments from the general public? This is receive and file. The chair will entertain a motion to receive
So
and file
moved.
the report. Second. Oh, I'm sorry.
You went back to public and you didn't finish directors.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Be a little faster.
I'm sorry?
Be a little faster. Keep
Okay.
moving.
Sorry. I'm Lynn Jensen with Ventura County CoLab. Really short comments. I just want to say I really support the comments that were made by Terry and Brian and Jim and reflected of the TAG. I think we're very fortunate to have the TAG as a team of experts. They're experienced hydrogeologists willing to do this as volunteers, and they have the local knowledge and a lot of data to go through. And I think the TAG has a reputation to keep as scientists because they are going to be backing this plan. I don't see what the advantage is of moving early if there's only a few months that they might need to look at the rest of the data. And I think it's important, as you have said, that the plan needs to be credible with sound assumptions, and I think only the TAG can assure that. And the TAG isn't just somebody else. This isn't just somebody else coming in and having an objection. They are the experts that will back this plan. So thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? And for future reference, when I ask that question, if you've got something to say, move forward. I'll see you move. I will not see your hands. So, David. They won't help.
He's got his own glasses that
I
don't
got
help.
glasses, I've got contacts, a telescope wouldn't help.
Director Bennett, I think, said it appropriately in that, prioritize those aspects of the pie chart that are most uncertain, that have the greatest amount of acre footage question. Yes, I mean, we heard that from the consultants, we heard that from TAG people too. An appropriate way to attack it. And I think it sounds to me that we're not just hearing from TAG, but also our staff, that they think it's a good idea we take a little more time to get some of this nailed down. So is it appropriate to take more time? Yes, I think it absolutely is. We've heard that from a number of sources. We've even heard it from our consultant that, there is great uncertainty in many of these things, and that when we're talking of levels of 15 to 20,000 acre feet of uncertainty, that ends up being a big deal to the pumpers. Curious side note, which I took from the Dudek's presentation. See if I can find my note here, my scrawl. There's not a strong correlation between pumping and storage. but there is a strong correlation between spreading and storage. And the uncertainty of United's operation, certainly we're well aware of, and it all the more determines to me that, not just this organization, but county board of supervisors, cities, city councils, individual farmers, pumpers. United needs help in this situation. We're not talking about just some ephemeral thing that, maybe they can divert some water or not. This is critical to this county's water future. And yet, United seems to kind of hit this battle by themselves. Now has come the time when they need help. And we, as a groundwater management agency, dependent upon their recharge, really ought to be side by side or the second in line. A side note, it's something that I've thought about for a long time. We need to do a better job in this agency of supporting United's efforts. Because really what they do, the consultant has shown us, is highly critical for our groundwater levels, our seawater intrusion, just about everything we're trying to solve on the Oxnard Plain. An accurate baseline or starting point is incredibly important, again, for the pumpers and those who use groundwater. And so to broad brush paint it and say, why do I need to get so refined? We need to get refined enough, because 10, 20,000 acre feet of difference, it's the ramp down that's important. If we're talking about a 10 or a 20-year ramp down, and think about it as a chart. If we're starting at 100,000 acre feet and we got to get to 60, we've got to cut 40,000 acre feet over a period of time. If we only have to go to 80, we're talking 20,000 acre feet over a period of time. That is a lot less of a hardship on all the pumpers and all the cities and folks relying on wells. That's why it's important to get it nailed down. The baseline is important, and what we start with is terribly important. So I'd finish with that. Thank you.
I'm sorry, but these are deliberative bodies, so you have to go back and forth. One, you made the statement that staff, you're even hearing from staff and the consultants that we should take more time. I think I'm hearing from them that there is significant uncertainty, and they recognize that, but I have not heard from staff that they're suggesting we take more time. Staff has put up a recommended proposal, so I just want to hear from staff. Are you recommending more time, or are you not recommending more time?
Director Bennett, Chair, board members, well, we are prepared, and the consultant's prepared to get the sustainability plan done in November. And so, but we did want to have a discussion of the pros and cons of that. And really the pros and cons are this. We know that the groundwater sustainability plan is not at the destination. We've got a lot of work to do. Wherever we take it, however far down the road we get, we know we're not getting to the East Coast, to use the metaphor that Director Aranio started, which is very good. We're going to stop periodically and make sure we're not headed south, and if we are, we'll correct and start heading east. So I do think I will say that the majority of TAG feel that a short extension of the schedule is prudent. One of the biggest challenges we've had with the schedule is the modeling effort, because it provides so much better information than there would have been, and we didn't know we were going to have that as we started, and that's one of the things that's pushed things out again so far. But United is feeling optimistic. They're finishing that up beginning of next year, at least at the point where they can really do the sensitivity analyses, provide the documentation the TAG's been looking for, and do the kind of forecast scenarios that will provide a little bit more confidence. So I think it would not be unreasonable for your board to consider a reasonable short, I'm not prepared to say what that is, extension of the schedule, into the early spring or something like that, not to analyze, not to have paralysis by analysis, which was what we could go for, but I think that it will be a more successful effort if you have the tag, or at least the majority of the tag, feeling that they have had the opportunity and the comfort level that they have to endorse the GSP. I think it will be a challenge if the GSP is at a point where the tag says, yeah, we really could have spent a few more months and got the thing to where we have a much better comfort level. So I think that's a challenge for us.
Is staff recommending more time?
Mr. Chair, could I just say that this delaying it is not on the agenda. This is not an action item. This is an item.
Sure.
If we're going to
I
change
realize
something,
we're not going to vote on
then
delay,
I
but
think
it's-
we need to bring it back for discussion at that time.
Maybe I should, let me give a direct answer to that. No, we're not. Kim, in internal discussions, we feel that, especially given the amount of work that we need your board to do, of course, there would be much more comfort level. But from tightening it down technically, whether it's 80,000 or 60,000, that will happen before the ramp down starts. And this is so related to other items on the agenda, like the allocation systems and the principles that were going to be recommended to you, that it's hard in isolation to answer that question. But the fact of the matter, no. Kim's trying to accurately reflect what TAG is doing. He's chairing that. He's trying to be true to that. And then more recently, we had in the operations committee, for example, there's a sticky public policy decision that's going to have to be discussed at your board. And we're looking at the board meeting schedule, and we're thinking, and so I think Kim's, the way he's answering the question, we'd be more comfortable, but that's not a recommendation. So there's going to be a number of policy. Well, I don't think from a technical, let me be more specific. From a technical perspective, I think that what we're recommending, if your board goes along with it in the allocation systems, we're going to have time to do the adjustments that Director Borcher's talking about, whether it's 80 or 60,000, and that will make TAG comfortable with the sustainable yield model. So that's not what's driving Kim's hesitation, is that there's a ton of public policy stuff that looks like it's going to have to happen in the next few months.
That was going to be my second question after asking, is staff asking for more time? And if the number turns out to be 80,000 instead of 60,000, right? In reality, that we would theoretically know that number before we got to ramping down to 80,000.
That's correct.
All right. So and in fact, if we decrease the uncertainty with that number, you would make the case that you have to start to head down towards that number sooner.
That's correct. In our presentation to DWR, in other words.
So you could theoretically end up with a higher number, but with less uncertainty, and the argument that therefore you know what the negative impacts are, and so you have more undesirable impacts that you're certain of, and you therefore have to go there.
Let me explain that. So we have to submit this. Your board has to adopt it. We have to submit it to DWR before you can go forward with the replenishment fee. So if you have that information and you're saying to DWR, we're not ramping down to it, you got some explaining to do. So that's the context when which I'm answering your question. If, however, you leave yourself some room when you submit to DWR, that's the way I'm answering that question, right? So, and it's a matter of art at this point, and a matter of public policy, and a matter of schedule. It's not, to my way of thinking, what's driving this at the moment isn't really the technical stuff as much as it is trying to create all of the water supply projects that likely will have to be added to create the crash pad that everybody's talking about are long lead times. And our recommendation to your board is to move as fast as you can towards those. And one item Kim didn't have in his long list of things that you're going to need to wrestle with are replenishment fees. And that is a thorny and sticky issue. And given my experience with the GMA, that in itself could take years, or more than a year, let's say. We're just pushing to get you where we think you need, where we're hearing the community wants to be. Crash pad, easy ramp, and some safety landing.
And a sustainability fee.
And absolutely, sustainability, forgot that.
I move to receive and file.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Moving on to item number 5.
Chair West, members of the board, for the record, Kim Loeb. This will be, I hope, a brief item as an update to the pumping allocation system development, alternative development. And your board has directed for both the 2 tracks that we're working on for new development or new allocation systems, Oxnard, Pleasant Valley, and the Las Posas Valley, that you want to see something pretty concrete by the end of the year, and we're on track for that. And we're on track for that regardless of the GSP schedule, and your board can move off of, adopt a new allocation system and move off of Ordinance E and irrigation IAI regardless of where we're at. Ultimately, the GSP is going to tell us how much total water is going to be available within each basin, but how that's allocated within the basin is somewhat independent of that. So just to briefly recall where we're at with the Las Posas Valley Basin, in June, the Las Posas Users Group had a revised white paper with their proposed allocation system that they'd gone through with a huge number of public stakeholder meetings. A new group had come to light of some stakeholders out there called the Las Posas Valley Water Rights Coalition, who had some concerns. Your board at that time directed that staff work with both the LPUG leadership and the Water Rights Coalition leadership to continue to understand the Water Rights Coalition's concerns about the work that had been done and to consider them and help move forward in developing that.
And have they identified leadership?
No, in spite of numerous attempts to have them identify who their leadership is and who represents them, rather other than the attorney that represents them, because we wanted to have with LPUG, we have the stakeholders in the basin representing that group. We wanted to have the stakeholders, the spokespeople for their Water Rights Coalition, to speak for them as well. And we still don't know who that is or who those people are. And we don't have, I believe that there may have been an initial meeting with the attorney, with the executive officers, but not a list of what their concerns are specifically. So we had been having regular monthly meetings on the Las Posas Valley with the LPUG leadership. The Water Rights Coalition people said they wanted to be invited. We said, fine, this is where we need to be resolving these things. We canceled the August meeting because we didn't know who would be coming. We still didn't have a identified representative for the September meeting, but I understand the invitation was passed on through the attorney, and we didn't have anybody show at that meeting. The next meeting is on October 9th, the regular scheduled meeting, and again, the invitation has been extended. So, but so far there's been no interaction by that group, although we have reached out. So we have continued to develop ordinance language based on the LPUG white paper and the comments that we've heard from stakeholders in your board. We tentatively plan to have a workshop on that ordinance at the October 25th meeting, and depending on where we're at and what feedback, we could be ready to consider adopting that in December. So that's where we're at with the Las Posas Valley. In terms of the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins, as you know, there's been certain agricultural and M&I stakeholders that have been meeting among themselves and together, and agency staff for some time has also been meeting with these folks to understand what their progress is in development and understand what the issues and concerns are there. We've had those two executive committee public hearings that were where a lot of this was flushed out and brought to the stakeholders, but subsequent to that, the groups told us they've reached a stalemate, and really the stalemate is on the diverted water from the Santa Clara River that goes to PV and the pumping trop pipeline principally. And so staff is moving forward with board's prior direction that we'll build a bridge allocation system that will be ready to implement. It'll get us off IAI. It'll be based more on historical allocations, similar to what we have done, the GMA's done in the past. It will be based on the 60-40 M&I Ag split, where the groups have been pretty well resolved on that split on groundwater alone, and that is pretty much what the historical record bears. And we will be bringing also at the October 25th meeting, we're going to bring the elements of where we're at in terms of the proposed bridge allocation system, and then from there we'll develop ordinance language based on feedback from your board and stakeholders. And this would be, should your board adopt it, would be in effect until such time as the stakeholders are able to get together and develop something that is something your board can support and to replace it. And so that concludes my remarks on the update on the allocation systems.
Questions from the board? No. Questions from the general public? Second? Second. All in favor? Aye. Okay, moving on to item number 6.
I'm just going to start. Chair West, board members, my name is Arnie Anselm, staff to the GMA. This is an update, a receive and file presentation on the water market and AMI pilot, and this is going to be, I'm going to have Matthew Feenup with Cal Lutheran also present with me. There we go. He's going to be giving an update on the whole project, so I'm not going to spend much time going back through the history. Just want to point out that this was approved by your board in December of 2016. The AMI demonstration project was provided a rebate system for growers who are participating in the water market of up to $6,000 per rebate. They would buy the equipment, we would give them the rebate, and they would own it, and that allowed them to enter into the water market, which was limited to 30 agricultural participants. And why we're here today is a report is due to your board on November 1st of 2017, and this will be the kind of first draft of that report for some feedback. Also, in the topic of water markets, we're close to receiving the NRCS efficiency grant. When we wrote the grant, the assumption was it would be starting on May 1st. It's been delayed several months. No subgrant agreement has been yet received from the Nature Conservancy, although they have entered into their grant agreement with NRCS. So the earliest this grant can start is in November. Just a quick refresher on what that grant is. It's 3 phases of a water market, slowly ramping up to agency-wide, and then the automated metering infrastructure that would fund up the equipment to up to 670 wells. The installation of those that equipment is over 1 year. So when we're thinking about going forward, some of the challenges we'll be facing are we're going to be transitioning to a new allocation system, as you heard. Currently, the IAI is too flexible for a water market. We need a cap and trade system for the water market, and so it is operating on a different allocation. The AMI installation in 1 year, 670 wells, we're going to be having to put in 5 to 10 a week to get that done. If there are delays or we don't have a lot of early adopters and get backloaded and have to really ramp up at the end of the year, that could be problematic. So we'd like to consider incentives for participation in the water market or early adoption of the AMI. And future board actions on the water market, the grant, would be we need to approve a sub-agreement, we need to adopt a water market ordinance, we need to adopt an AMI ordinance so we can get that installed agency-wide. We need to select a contractor and have that contract approved, and then also not just for the equipment, but for managing the data, hosting the data. And the water market and the allocation systems go hand in hand, so we would need to get that in place as well. And the details of these will be worked out through the Operations and Water Market Ad Hoc Committee.
Excuse me.
Yes.
A quick question while you were on that other page. Is it anticipated you'll offer the board one contractor to do all the installation, or will there be a list or a choice?
Through the grant, it is one contractor, one vendor.
Oh.
So before we get to the receiving file, is Matthew still here? Here. Oh, hey, Matthew. Great. I was looking back where you're sitting. So we need presentation 6B.
Thanks, Aaron.
Sure.
So I'm Matthew Feenup, California Lutheran University. Thanks for having me. I just wanted to present a first draft of the report, findings and recommendations regarding Phase 1 of the water market pilot. And so to begin, I just wanted to start placing where we're at in history and run through a quick set of steps to how we got here. The origin of the water market pilot actually traces its roots back to February 2014 and a particular PTP users group meeting. At that time, agricultural water users were considering the effects of an emergency drought ordinance that was being discussed here at the agency and what those impacts would be. And so it was in the context of confronting cuts to agricultural water use that growers began talking about a system of capping water use and then trading water in order to give them flexibility to adapt to the cuts that they saw were coming. And of course, Emergency Ordinance E was passed shortly after that meeting. Originally, there were a series of other meetings among growers, literally dozens, small groups of growers meeting, led principally by Edgar Terry and myself, talking about market allocation of water. And so there was dozens of meetings over about 18 months. And in August of 2015, Edgar Terry, myself, with the help of John Christ, had 5 meetings, one with each of the directors of the GMA at that time, to actually discuss the sort of consensus proposal that was being developed among growers for a water market. And actually Jeff Pratt was also part of those meetings in August of 2015. In late fall of 2015, the Fox Canyon Growers Group, so the stakeholder group that regularly met with GMA staff, was actually meeting to discuss the first round of IAI reporting, groundwater extraction reporting under Emergency Ordinance E. And the context there that's important is that Emergency Ordinance E originally envisioned potential additional reductions in agricultural pumping for February 1st, 2015 and for August 1st, 2015. And so when the first round of IAI reporting came back and growers were concerned that these 2 additional 10% cuts were going to be implemented in the next year, and they were concerned what that would mean for agricultural operations in the drought. And so they actually devised something called the interim plan, where they actually worked out a specific proposal to present to the board of directors. And this one, as far as I understand, being written up in a board letter, the executive officer's board letter at one point. And so the specific details of the interim plan look a lot like the actual water market that has been implemented under the pilot. And so growers were proposing fixing allocation, so actually ending the IAI after the first year of reporting, and actually moving to a fixed allocation that was based on historical use. They proposed at that time 90% of the 14-15 reported pumping for the following year. And then they proposed additional 10% cuts, but rather than phased in rapidly in 2015, phasing those in over 2 subsequent years, those being 16-17 and 17-18. They proposed increased surcharges and universal advanced metering infrastructure. And that was carefully coupled with the last point, which is they proposed a formal centralized market for trading allocation. So confronted with these cuts, the 10% cuts to groundwater use, growers recognized that they would need flexibility and proposed a water market as the source of that flexibility. So here's the esteemed executive officer here in this picture, and the actual sketch that those growers worked out at that time. The reaction with the GMA was actually to expand the growers group. And so in very late 2015 and January 2016, the water market group was chartered, which was an expansion. It was all the original members of the growers group, plus included invitations to municipal water users, to the cities of Oxnard, Camarillo, and Ventura, and also included the Nature Conservancy representing environmental water use. And that group was chartered here through the GMA with the goal of developing a set of recommendations arrived at through consensus regarding the structure and operational mechanisms for a water market. So the Water Market Group had its first meeting in January 2016. I was chosen as the chair, Edgar Terry as the co-chair, and that group met 14 separate times over 7 months. And in September 2016, a core group that was regularly attending those meetings approved a set of recommendations which were submitted to the GMA regarding the structure of a water market. One of the recommendations was that we engage in a water market pilot, so a test market, the idea simply being that this was a totally new policy instrument in the county and that we should approach it modestly and create an adaptive structure that let us learn as we go and correct adapting rules and regulations as needed. So phase 1 of the Fox Canyon Water Market and AMI pilot was authorized in December of 2016. That ordinance had an effective date in February of this year, 2017. Immediately, we sort of got notice of the broader Nature Conservancy organization in California and their Sacramento office actually identified a conservation innovation grant that they thought this project was an excellent candidate for. So in the waning hours of 2016 and the first 2 days of 2017, GMA staff, myself, and the Nature Conservancy applied for a conservation innovation grant to support expansion of the water market. In that same month, in January, Ranch Systems was selected as the AMI vendor, and Cal Lutheran was officially chosen as the exchange administrator, although an exchange administrator agreement was not signed until late March, in particular because of some disagreements about hold harmless agreements between CLU and the agency. In February, we held a water market pilot workshop where we actually rolled out the design, what the rules would be, got input from growers who were considering participation, and then in April, actually began enrolling individuals in the water market pilot. In June, the Conservation Innovation Grant was awarded. In July, we held a data portal and trading workshop. So this is after the data portal was up and live and running, and we were collecting data from water market participants. That data portal and trading workshop also included a full demonstration of the actual exchange. So simulated water users were created and simulated bids and offers were submitted, and the trading algorithm was demonstrated at that time. And then on July 31st, phase 1 officially concluded. And so to describe pilot activity, it was a roller coaster of sorts. So initial interest in the water market pilot was very strong. So following the water market workshop that was held in February, we received requests from 22 separate COM codes to enroll, representing 47 different wells, to enroll in the water market pilot. Now, the rules of the water market pilot are that all participants, in order to be deemed eligible, had to be shown to be in compliance with all existing rules and regulations under all existing GMA ordinances. And so of those 22 different COM codes, so a process began. When a COM code requested participation, the COM code was sent to GMA staff. They had to first be identified that they were within the correct geographic area. It had to be determined whether or not they were in compliance with all existing rules, and then a determination had to be made of their fixed market allocation. So there were 3 steps, 3 pieces of information that were needed from GMA. Of 22 different COM codes, initially only 10 were deemed eligible. So 9 COM codes were deemed ineligible because they did not meet the existing agency's meter calibration requirement. 1 COM code was deemed ineligible because it had surcharges during the 2014-15 water. That's to say they'd pumped more than their allocation. And then 2 COM codes were deemed temporarily ineligible because of overdue fees and surcharges. In fact, there were 5 COM codes with overdue fees, but 3 of those had already been disqualified for other reasons. So that left us with an initial batch of eligible COM codes equaling just 10. 1 COM code was deemed ineligible after it enrolled because it was actually shown to be outside the geographic area identified by the ordinance. And so Ranch System, to its credit, actually at their expense moved the hardware to another facility that owner had that was within the geographic area. So of those 22, in fact only 9 were actually qualified. So of 9 initially eligible COM codes, and then 1 became eligible later, 6 of those COM codes completed enrollment contracts, but only 4 of those completed AMI installation prior to the expiration of Phase 1 on July 31st. 3 additional COM codes were created in order to create eligible participants for the water market. So in each of these cases, this is a grower that had multiple wells under a COM code, some of which were out of compliance, and they tried to carve off eligible wells to create a unit that could be enrolled in the pilot. For 2 of these, COM code creation took more than 7 weeks, leaving insufficient time for the new COM code to be enrolled. The 3rd new COM code, COM code was created in just 2 or 3 weeks. They completed an enrollment contract, but AMI installation took longer than the time that remained in the pilot. And so where we're left then is with 6 COM codes having signed contracts, but only 4 who successfully installed AMI and were actually feeding data to the data portal. So among those 4 COM codes, total market allocation, so the total fixed allocation for that group was just over 1,000 acre-feet. There would have been an additional 718 acre-feet had the 2 other COM codes installed AMI in time, but we were left with just 1,000. And the total annual water use last year for those 4 COM codes was just 365 acre-feet, or less than 34% of their fixed allocation. Obviously, there were no bids and offers submitted because it was clear that there were no buyers of allocation. So we had started the idea of the water market pilot worrying that there would be only buyers and there would be no one selling water. And then for a number of reasons, what ended up happening was that there were only sellers and there was nobody who needed additional allocation. You can see here among the individual pilot participants, water use did range from a low of 21% to 63%. And again, this is data that's streaming. This is being objectively monitored by Ranch Systems and streamed to the data portal. So this is real-time extraction data. You will notice, though, that there's one irregularity here, which is that the last reading for 3 of the 4 COM codes was before July 31st, the last end of the pilot. So that's to say with 3 of the 4 COM codes, there were reporting irregularities at the end. There were technical problems that Ranch Systems had to troubleshoot and fix before we could get updated reports. So for example, in the last COM code there, the last reading on June 29th was 86 acre-feet. After the pilot had completed, they reported 131 acre-feet, and so their annual water use is somewhere between those two numbers. So there were some milestones. There were some very significant accomplishments of phase one of the water market pilot. One of the biggest of those is the data portal design and implementation. So Ranch Systems did an amazing job building a custom data portal that had different access privileges for water market participants. That is, agricultural water users participating in the market got to see the highest resolution of data available. They have an entire suite of tools available to them through the Ranch Systems platform. And then they also created a system where the exchange administrator, Cal Lutheran, could actually see all of the COM codes enrolled and could actually track year-to-date pumping and track the water that was available for transfer in the market. And they also built a access tier for the agency, where the agency could also see all of the people enrolled in the water market and actually could see monthly pumping totals, which again is a higher resolution of data than the GMA had previously seen. They were moved from 6-month pumping reports to 1-month pumping reports. There were some AMI innovations. So even though the Ranch Systems platform is built on existing hardware that they were using on other ranches, there was some technological innovation that was tailored to this program. An important one is validation measures. So the actual hardware had technology added to it, which provides validation measures for the agency. So if someone, for example, if a totalizer is turning over, or rather if a pump is running, if there's electrical current running through a pump and the meter totalizer is not turning, right, an alarm signal is sent to the water market, to the agency, and to the water user. And this is just an example of one of 3 different layers of validation measures that were invented over the course of the water market pilot. Development of a transition protocol, how to move people off of the existing reporting system onto the new one was a bit of an organizational challenge. And then there was a tremendous amount of troubleshooting of installation problems, hardware problems, including the problems that were highlighted in the previous slide, where data wasn't transmitted one of the monthly reporting periods. Another of the milestones was a dry run of the water market exchange. Even though no actual transfers of groundwater pumping happened, simulated bids and offers were submitted, matches were made, and that trading algorithm was demonstrated. And then over the course of all of this, there was a significant reduction in administrative response times to things like enrolling participants, getting the 3 data points that were necessary from agency staff to confirm eligibility, and even things like creating COM codes. The initial try at each of those was lengthy, and that administrative response time was cut dramatically over the course of the pilot. And then, of course, one of the important milestones here was the award of the Conservation Innovation Grant. That's really external validation of the uniqueness and the importance of the work that's being attempted here. So I show this just for reference. We can come back to this if people have questions about it, but this is the grower's view of the Ranch Systems data portal. So there's a satellite image that shows the location of their well. If this were the exchange administrator or the agency's data portal view, it would show all of the wells, and then the data and the tools available would be different. So you can see here a grower gets to see market allocation, total pumping year to date, total monthly pumping, water available for transfer, and then they can select other views which provide them with minute by minute, whatever pumping data is available that's been transmitted by the device they have access to. These tools on the left also give them the option to implement control, turning pumps on and off, moving water between irrigation blocks, and that sort of thing. The toolbox on the left is significantly reduced for the agency and the exchange administrator's view. And then this is just for reference regarding the Conservation Innovation Grant. So the Fox Canyon Water Market and AMI pilot was part of a $1.9 million Conservation Innovation Grant award. That was the single largest award that NRCS made last year among 38 separate awards that were issued. And again, it funds implementation of AMI and expansion of the water market here, as well as a project that the Nature Conservancy is involved in the Central Valley. So in terms of findings, sort of what have we learned? I wanted to highlight some of the impediments to participation. One of the obvious questions is how did we, with initial interest that was strong, how did we end up with so few participants at the end? And program eligibility obviously was one of the most important. Only 40% of people interested in participating actually qualified for participation. And the way that the rules are currently implemented, there was actually a perverse incentive. If you, in order to participate, you had to pass meter calibration, you had to pay overdue fees, and if you chose not to participate, you did not have to calibrate your meter, which in the case of one interested participant actually meant replacing the meter at significant cost to themselves. And so there were sort of two regulatory regimes, one for pilot participants and one for those who didn't. Another obvious impediment is the lack of scarcity of water this year. That came in the form of above average rainfall, but it also comes in the form of the current allocation system. And so I wanted to talk briefly about the IAI and the market allocation that folks were issued. So you can see the numbers that I have here are from the IAI report, agency-wide IAI groundwater extraction report for 2014-15. If we look at agricultural COM codes, 251 of them on that report, there were only 17 that had an IAI value of greater than 1. So this is in one of the driest years of the drought. The average IAI value is just 0.73, so that's to say the average grower was using 73% of the so-called efficient amount, and total allowed agricultural pumping under the IAI was 129,700 acre-feet that year. So if we move everyone to, if they increase their pumping until they have an IAI value of 1, and they still remain below the hard cap, the allowed agricultural pumping was 130,000 acre-feet. And what we're talking about doing with pilot participants is moving them off that allocation and onto a fixed allocation that on average is going to be a 27% reduction from the IAI. So when people accept a fixed market allocation, on average that's going to only be 73% of the full IAI value. So that means that market participants have a cap that's substantially lower than non-market participants. And then of course we had above average rainfall. So there's incentives involved in the current allocation system. Other impediments, this is from a potential market participant. There was one COM code that was concerned that there was no AMI standard currently in place. They actually asked agency staff, if we install this AMI hardware now, can you guarantee that in 2 years this will still be acceptable under the AMI ordinance that's coming down? And since agency staff could not provide that guarantee, they said, well, we'll wait until the AMI standard is written. And so that was the cause of one large COM code defecting from participation. I mentioned administrative response times. This one we've cut back on significantly, but it did prevent a certain number of COM codes from enrolling. And then another one we heard about was unanticipated costs of AMI installation. So the original AMI Water Market Pilot AMI ordinance authorized incentives of up to $2,000 per well. But it actually turns out that many users, in some cases, need AMI that costs more, or in other cases would like AMI that costs more. And so you can see here one case where the cost is more than $2,000 has to do with simple things like how far the meter is from the pump. And if it's more than 15 feet, then installation actually costs more than $2,000. If individual growers already have things like sensors of various types or variable frequency drive pumps, they actually can't use the basic AMI unit. They need a more expensive unit that costs $800 extra. And then, of course, meter calibration imposes significant costs. It's about $800 just to get the meter calibrated if everything is working properly. Obviously, if the situation requires a new meter, then that can be several $1,000s of additional cost. And so these are some of the impediments. So our recommendations are, first of all, uniform enforcement of agency regulations. And so meter calibration requirement should apply to all participants, whether they participate in the pilot or not. We would recommend finalizing the AMI specification. That's happening naturally, and that's being worked on at the committee level now. And then another one that the Nature Conservancy and I have thought about and talked about a lot is, and make a formal recommendation here, is to provide economic incentives to offset some of these other disincentives to participating in the pilot. So in the context of the NRCS grant, that's a water market grant. And the NRCS's goal, what the project they're funding, is an expanded, robust water market that will allow us to learn about this policy tools with the hope that it can be implemented in other parts of the state. And so in order to do a robust trial of that market, as it currently stands, we would propose incentives, financial incentives, to drive that voluntary participation. And I'll provide you a sketch that the Nature Conservancy and I developed. We also recommend expanded participation to include a broader geographic area and potentially additional water user groups. And so currently the phase 1 of the pilot was restricted to the inland part of the Oxnard Plain Basin outside of the salinity management area. And so we would recommend geographic expansion, possibly even including the salinity management area, so that we can actually test the restrictions that would be necessary for trade to support the hydrologic goals, specifically of transferring pumping out of the salinity management area and preventing additional pumping from migrating into the salinity management area. There were some insights that we developed about specific water market rules. Tighter language is required regarding individual water users who refuse to finalize a transfer. Obviously, also the lack of reports in the final month of the pilot hint that there needs to be a requirement that participants successfully report for 2 consecutive periods before any bid or offer is submitted, just so that we know the current data that we have in the data portal is up to date. Single point of contact at the GMA to handle administrative functions. And then a recommendation that was made to us in the next phase was also to start mapping individual market participants and their wells to specific aquifers. So, there's the potential for transfers of groundwater pumping to either positively or negatively impact the distribution of water quality. That happens when pumping's moved into or out of the salinity management area, and it may also have impacts when pumping is transferred from one aquifer to another. And so a recommendation was made that we should begin to track those, just map individual water users to specific aquifers and just keep track of when pumping is being moved from one aquifer to another, so that can be analyzed and dealt with in the future. So here's the specific incentive recommendation that the Nature Conservancy and I developed. There are, as Arnie mentioned, there's funds in the Conservation Innovation Grant for 670 AMI installations, funded by a combination of grant and agency funds. And so we propose an actual tiered structure of incentives where early adopters who implement AMI technology earlier in the year and who enroll voluntarily in the water market actually receive additional financial benefits. So $3,000 per well as opposed to the base current rebate of $2,000. That money would have to be spent on technology, on water-saving technology and AMI technology. But they would have additional incentives in order to enroll early and to participate in the water market. And this is just a roll-up of what those tiered rebates would look like. For 700 wells, we would come in at $1.35 million, which is within the current scope of funding provided by the grant. Right, and that concludes my remarks, and I welcome any questions or suggestions or comments.
Questions from the board? Questions from the general public?
Thanks.
Jeanette Lombardo, California Women for Agriculture. Couple of questions for you, Matt. You talked about the number of comp codes and the percentage of growers, but I need to know the number of transfers that were actually done and the number of growers.
No transfer.
0 transfers, and how many growers were involved?
Yeah, so,
Who had the 4 COM codes?
well, so and actually, this is an anonymized water market pilot.
Okay.
And so the reporting and trading unit here is the COM code, so I can tell you 4 COM codes were enrolled. And in this case, we're talking.
So 1 grower with 4 COM codes?
No,
or?
in this case, these are separate growers.
Okay. So do you feel that this is enough data to do the statistical analysis that you're looking at here? Because I just feel it's not adequate.
Right, so that's why this is
Okay.
the end of phase 1, and we're making recommendations for phase 2.
Okay, so let me ask you this. The ranch system that is used and the data that they're collecting of all the water markets throughout the state of California that I've called and worked with, I don't see them going into this level of detail. So I'm wanting to know who determined the detail for that customized system that was made.
And I'm not entirely sure what the question is. Or do you mean what was required of market participants, or do you mean what hardware? Yeah.
Yeah. No, you had
Refine your question.
Okay, so you had the ranch system design a custom system for this water market. Who determined the level of detail? I mean, that seems like a little bit of an overkill.
So actually, that was the outgrowth of an agency staff can tell me, 6 or 7 month long, they'll correct me on the number, stakeholder process that was facilitated by the GMA with input from growers. So it was actually growers who made those proposals.
And so was this a representative amount of growers, or are we talking like 5 growers?
I'm aware of a list of about 20 growers who actively participated in all of the meetings, or nearly all the meetings, and a list of about 50 who were carefully following the work of the group.
Okay. Final question. You mentioned an interim plan. As you know, I'm here every meeting, and I read everything. I don't recall an interim plan being brought forth for public comment. So if Jeff or you could provide me with that documentation, I would appreciate that. And then the other thing is, I started the PTP users group, but it didn't start till January 2015. So I think in your first slide there, what you're referring to is perhaps the United PT Pumping Group.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Thank you, Matt. This is a receive and file. Is there a motion?
A motion?
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
I am advised that items 7 and 8 are not time sensitive. If it's the preference of the board, we can table those 2 items to another meeting.
I think 3 hours and 45 minutes is enough.
All right. Hearing no objection, we'll table 7 and 8. I just did want to go to, before we get to the executive officer's report, the addendum with respect to the special meeting that was scheduled for November 10th, as that's Veterans Day. I guess it's a holiday that day, so we need to look at alternate dates. Jeff, was there an alternate date proposed for that meeting?
Chair West, there are tentative dates that I have reserved for board supervisors hearing. I wanted to give you those options, or we can move to it. So as of right now,
Monday, November 13th, and Tuesday, November 21st. I have reserved it at the 1:30 normal starting time, as well as Wednesday, November 15th at a 3 p.m. starting time. Or your board may also choose to hold an evening meeting on a date of your choosing in November.
I would prefer 3 o'clock on November 15th, Wednesday.
I think I agree. It'd be nice to have some separation between the regular meeting and the special meeting. Although it's only a week.
November 15th?
Wednesday, November 15th, 3 o'clock.
That works for me, and it works for Charlotte. I have her calendar here.
Oh, wow. That is good technology. Most efficient thing that happened in this meeting.
Robert, does that work for you?
Yeah.
3 o'clock, 15th.
Okay, well, we will schedule the special meeting then for November 15th at 3 o'clock. Do do we need a motion and a second to approve that?
So moved.
Second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
We need a motion to receive and file the executive officer's report.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
We are adjourned. Thank you. You let